In this video, we're going to build our own crowdfunding platform just like Kickstarter without writing a single line of code using a tool called Bubble. Now before I say another word, let me show you a quick preview of exactly what we're going to build today. Over in a preview of my Kickstarter clone, you can see right now that we're on the home page, and if I scroll on down, I can see some stats about all of the projects that have been funded in my application, but I can also see a list of featured projects. Now, if I was to click through to one of these projects, it's going to take me through to the dedicated project page. And once I'm on this project page, I can view the full details about it. So I can see what the funding goal is, how much has already been pledged, how many backers there are, how many days there are to go, as well as a video. So when I hit play here, it's going to play the featured project video. I can also scroll on down and view the full details of this campaign. So it's going to tell me the story behind this project. But if I also wanted, I can see all of the available rewards in which I can pledge. And of course, a list of all of the project updates that the creator of this project has posted. So I can actually follow the progress of this as it comes to life. Now, when it comes to backing the project, let's say I want to back by pledging an amount here for this particular reward, and I want to buy 2 of them. What I'm going to do is select pledge. It's then going to run a workflow and redirect me through to a dedicated Stripe checkout. And at this checkout, I can add in my credit card details. And once I've added in my details, I can choose to pay for this. It's going to run another workflow. It'll process that payment and then send me back to my application. And back in my application, I can see that that has been added to my profile. Now, speaking of profiles, if I ever wanted to view my own profile or the profile of anyone else in our Kickstarter clone, you can easily do this. And on this profile page, it's going to display all of the information about this person. So right now I can view things about their bio. I can also view a list of all of the projects that they've created, as well as all of the projects that they've backed. Of course, I can also choose to follow this user, but something I also want to show you is the back end of what it looks like when you're a creator in our Kickstarter clone. So let's say if you've created a project that people can fund, we obviously need a way to manage that process. So if I scroll on up here to my navigation bar, not only do we have a fully functional search feature where you can search by, let's say, a project name or even by a project category, what we can actually do is choose to either start a new project or manage our existing projects. Now today I'm just going to show you how I can manage my existing projects. So right now in this account, I can see I have 2 projects, and I can either choose to edit the details of each project. So when I click this button, it's going to take me through this process where I can change any of the important details. So things like the campaign description, or perhaps even all of the rewards on offer. But if I just click save and jump back to my manage page, what I'm interested in showing you is the dedicated dashboard. So when I click this button, it's going to take us through to a dedicated page where we can view all of the analytics for this project. So I can see what the funded amount is, how many page views it's received, and if I scroll on down, I can see a list of all of the people who have backed this project, as well as exactly which reward they selected and what the quantity was. Now, the other thing I can do is create like status updates for this project through the post tab. So when I click on this, it's going to take us through to the separate section, and I can choose to create and publish a new post. So that way all of my backers or anyone just discovering my project can stay up to date with all of the status updates I've published. Now look, this is just a small set of all of the features I've created in our Kickstarter clone today. There's still so much happening behind the scenes that I can't wait to show you. If you've ever tried to build your own app or startup, I'm sure you know firsthand just how complicated the entire process can be. If you're a non-technical person who doesn't know how to code, just like this guy, you can either try and source a technical co-founder, which if I can be honest is going to take a whole lot of time and a whole lot of butt kissing, or you could pay a developer to go ahead and build your app for you. Now I hope you're ready to choose between a house deposit or building your own MVP, because the price of paying a traditional software developer is through the roof.
It's losing money! Oh, yeah.
But thankfully, now there's a third option which completely changes the game. If you don't know how to code, Bubble is going to be your new best friend on your startup journey. Bubble is what's known as a no-code tool, which in simple terms just means you can build fully functional applications without having to write a single line of code. Using Bubble, I've been able to create absolutely every app you could imagine. So things from marketplaces, ride-sharing apps, dating apps, directories, appointment scheduling apps, and everything else in between. While there are plenty of no-code tools available that help with certain parts of the building process, Bubble is what's known as a full-stack solution. So it includes absolutely everything you need inside of one single platform. Bubble allows you to set up and create your own custom database. It allows you to design the interface of your app. You can then stitch everything together and make it functional using visual workflows. And finally, you can integrate with pretty much any third-party tool or service. So that just helps extend the capabilities of the entire platform. Now look, each one of those features would be a standalone no-code tool. So it truly just blows my mind that Bubble includes all of this under one single tool. Now look, at this point in time, I've rambled on for long enough. Let's just grab our Bubble editor and we can dive right into it. When it comes to our Kickstarter clone today, the first thing I wanted to build out isn't actually a core user-facing feature. Instead, I wanted to take the time to set up and configure our own custom database. So the database is going to be what powers the rest of our entire product. And without this, we're not going to be able to bring it to life. Now, if you are relatively new to Bubble, the process of creating your own database can be very overwhelming. I remember when I first started out, this was one of the more challenging aspects of the build. But look, thankfully, today I'm here to help make the whole process as simple as possible for you. Now, when it comes to setting up my database and building out all of my features today, what I've done is I've created a checklist of all of the items that I need to add into my own Bubble application. So if I was to scroll on down, you can see that these are all related to my database. And then if I keep scrolling, you can see a long list of all of the features I'm about to add in. And this honestly just goes on for days. But when it comes to building out a product in Bubble, what I first like to do is create a checklist of all of the items that I'm going to add in. Just so that way, once I've finished building them out, I can tick them off and keep track of where I am throughout this build. Now, when it comes to creating my checklist here, I just use a tool called Notion. Notion's just a great note-taking app. And look, if you want to make a copy of my checklist here, I'll be sure to include a link in the description of this video, so that way you can make a free copy of this as well. But when it comes to actually building out our database, before we jump into Bubble, there's two really important things I need to highlight. Or I should say, there's two really important concepts that you need to grasp. And that is the difference between a data type and a data field. And so if you're not familiar with Bubble, everything I just said will probably sound like complete gibberish, and that's okay. What you might notice in my checklist here is that within my database, I have these headings followed by a list of items that I'm going to check off. And so to put things simply, these headings are my data types. And now a data type is the overall thing that you need to create inside of your database. And then the data fields are all of the information that sit inside of that overall thing. So for example, if a user was to create a new user account within your database, the overall thing they would create is the user data type. And within every user account, they'll add things like their name, their profile photo, a bio, a list of people that they follow, and so on. So the overarching thing you're going to create would be the user. That is your data type. And the information that sits inside of that is the data field. Now, when it comes to your data types, this can still get people a little choked up along the way. It's sometimes difficult to understand when something should be an actual data type. And look, my rule of thumb is pretty straightforward. If your user ever needs to create something inside of your app, that should be a data type. So let's quickly just scroll down and look at what I've created. So within my Kickstarter clone today, it's safe to imagine that users are going to need to create their own account. So that's why my user here is a data type. And if I scroll on down, there is another data type called a project. So this is the actual project that someone can publish on the platform. And because a user is going to create their own projects, this needs to be its own data type. And of course, inside of this, we've got all of the data fields. So things like the title, the subtitle, when the campaign end date is, how much they're trying to raise in funding, and so on. And look, I'll break these down as I add them into Bubble. I then have what's known as a project satellite. Now, I'm not going to overcomplicate things right now and explain this, but essentially this links to this data type here. So anytime you have data fields that need to store a lot of heavy information, so things like videos or long form text, it's smart to break these out into a separate data type, but we're not going to cross that bridge yet. But I do just want to highlight that this is here. Then for every project, it should have a list of rewards that someone can purchase. So let's say if you were to list a project on your Kickstarter clone, within that project, you could tell me about all of the great details of it, but you could also say, Lachlan, if you're going to back my project, here are the rewards you can select from. So there's 3 different tiers. You could contribute $29 for reward number 1, $49 for reward number 2, or $99 for reward number 3. And so every single time someone wants to create a reward for a project, they're going to create a thing essentially. So that's why this should be a data type. Then there is the pledge. So let's say if I like your project and I decide I want to contribute to it, we just need to create a record of, first of all, how much I'm contributing, what type of reward I've selected, and what the quantity of that reward is. So that's why, once again, every time I create something in my database, it will be a data type. And then finally, the last data type is going to be related to a post. So if you, once again, were the owner of a Kickstarter project, you might want to create a post or an update that just explains the progress of this project. And so every single time you create and publish a post, you're obviously creating a thing in your database. And once again, I have what's known as the satellite data field for this, and I'll break that down in a moment. So as you can see here, before I ever build anything out in Bubble, I like to just sit down and think about all of the different types of things that users will create inside of my app. And it just allows me to be, I guess, more methodical or strategic about the way I set up my database. And look, it's going to be much easier than actually trying to set it up on the fly. Because when you're more articulate about how you set this up beforehand, you can make sure things are robust and well optimized. And I'll explain my thinking as we start to build this out inside of Bubble. So let's jump over into our brand new Bubble editor here. At this point in time, we have nothing created, and it's going to stay that way for now, because instead of building out the design of our app, we're going to open up our data tab here, and this is where you can view and create items inside of your database. And the first thing you might notice is that on the left-hand side here, we have our data types, and then on the right-hand side, we have all of our fields within our data type. And you might also see that by default, the user data type already exists. Now that's going to be the case for every single Bubble application. The reason why the user data type already comes within your app is because in order for someone to actually use your app through an account, they're going to need to register an account. So that's why this will come standard. And look, within the data fields for our user data type, you might also notice that by default, it has an email data field. So you don't need to add that out. And the reason for that is because whenever you register a user's account, you need to store an email and a password. It's mandatory inside of Bubble. Now there is a data field for the password, but you won't see this here. Bubble hides that for security reasons, but I just want to point that out because you do not need to create this. So the email and password, already taken care of. What we need to do though now is go in and add all of our data types before we can build out our data fields. And the reason I like to add all of my data types in first is because later on I'm going to explain how some of our data fields can actually link to separate data types. So in order to create those links, we need to first have those data types in. So I'm going to quickly walk through all of the different data types once again, but the next data type we need to add in is going to be our project. So we're going to come to the left-hand side here, type in the word project and create this. Now something I should point out as well is when it comes to your data types, you should never add a plural here. It should always be a singular item because technically I get it, inside of your database, you are going to have multiple projects because let's say 10 users come in and they all create one project each. Yes, you will have projects in your database. However, someone will only create one project at a time. So one singular item. Things start to get very confusing and messy if you add a plural here. And the reason for that is because later on throughout our build, you'll see that Bubble will actually automatically add plurals for you. And so if I was to call this projects, it would be projects. And look, that was a tongue twister for me. So you just want to try and avoid that. So once again, please don't make these data types a plural. It's just going to confuse yourself later on. If I jump back to my Notion checklist though, we can scroll on down. And the next data type I'm going to add in is my project satellite. Now I just want to explain this in a little bit more detail. So within our project data type, the data type that we just added, I'm storing quite a bit of information here. So there's things like the title, the subtitle, the category, the campaign end date, and so on. But the thing about all of these data fields are that they're relatively lightweight. We're not really storing too much information. The title might just be 5 or 10 words. The category is just going to be a couple of words. The campaign end date is literally just date. There's not much in that. And the funding amount is just going to be a small number. So these are relatively lightweight. Now, the way it works in Bubble is that if I was to display a list of, let's say, 10 projects on my homepage, so when you open up Kickstarter, it will display a list of featured projects on the homepage. What Bubble automatically does whenever it displays a project is that it loads all of the data fields, even the data fields that aren't being displayed. So if I was only displaying, let's say, the project title, its funding goal, and the thumbnail image, Bubble's still going to load every single data field for that data type. Now look, that's fine when we've got lots of small information being stored in each of our data fields. But when it comes to large data fields or bits of information, like storing a featured video, which can be gigabytes, or if you've got the campaign description, which could be a very long form piece of text, we don't really want to have to load these automatically when we're not showing them on our homepage. And the reason for that is because if you've got, let's say, 10 or even 100 items that you want to display inside of your Bubble app, you don't want it to have to load 100 different videos because that would be hundreds of gigabytes of data. So that's going to quickly slow your application down. So that is the importance of creating what's known as a satellite data type. Now, why the word satellite? Look, it's a pretty cute analogy actually. Let's say we've got our main data type here, which is our project. What we can do is create this satellite that floats around in space and contains all of those larger data fields. And then whenever we want to display information from this satellite, we can just send a quick message back to our original data type. And then we can pull and display that information. So technically, this information here does not sit within our main data type, so it's not going to be loaded by default. However, we can create a connection between these two data types so we can pull and reference any information later on, only when we need it, because we don't want to create any unnecessary loading for large data fields. So that's why we've created this satellite data type. And look, the word satellite for a data type is a pretty common thing within the industry. And you'll see I use another satellite in a moment, but I just wanted to take the time to explain this now. So let's jump into our Bubble editor and type in project, satellite. I will choose to create this. We can jump back into Notion, scroll on down, and the next data type was the project reward. So as I mentioned, whenever someone publishes a project, they're going to be able to type in and select what rewards they're going to offer for people who back it. So I'm going to jump into Bubble, type in project reward. We can go back to Notion. Then there is the pledge. So this is just like, I want to create a record for every transaction that happens on our platform. So when someone pledges money, we're going to store how much they pledged, what projects they pledged that for, and what rewards they selected. So I'm going to type in pledge. We can jump back to Notion. Then there was the post, which, as I mentioned, if someone has created a project, they should be able to create status updates essentially. So I've just called this a post. You could call this a status update. Doesn't really matter what you call it, as long as you don't add a plural on it. That's my only rule of thumb here. So let's jump into Bubble here, type in the word post, hit enter. That will create that data field. And then similarly, when it comes to our post, I'm going to create a satellite here, or I should say a satellite data type. And the reason I'm doing this is because when it comes to a Kickstarter post, these things aren't short. These status updates are very detailed. So often there'll be thousands of words about how hard the person who's creating the project is building it, what are the roadblocks along the way, what are the technicalities of it. And so these can be quite long form text. And so what I've done is I've created a satellite data type to store that long form text, which is going to be the content of that post. And then within this, I'm also storing a list of users. So these are all of the people who have liked this post, because if you get thousands of people who have liked a post, you're storing thousands of pieces of data. So it's quite a bit. So that's why I'm storing this in the satellite data type. But of course, later on, we're going to create a connection between these two. So I just need to create a data field known as the post satellite. So I'm going to jump into Bubble and I will do that. And now it's time to add all of the data fields in that sit inside of each data type. And look, I'm completely kidding. There's another core concept I'm going to introduce that's going to confuse the hell out of you. And look, I'm sorry, but I'm not sorry. If we scroll on down here, before I add in all of my data fields, what I'd like to do is introduce a concept known as option sets. And the reason I want to point this out right now is because we need to create the option sets before we create our data fields. But of course, what on earth are option sets, Lachlan? I'm glad you asked. Option sets are like a data type, which is why I'm introducing them now before I add in my data fields. But if you remember, when it came to data types, I mentioned that you should create a data type for every single thing that your users will create inside of your app. So once again, they could create their own account, their own project, they could create a post. But what about information that you as the admin and owner of your app would like to create yourself? This is where option sets come into play. So option sets are essentially just a way to create information that's going to sit in your database that only you as the admin can create. And it's going to be pre-created. So what do I mean by that? With your data types, we don't know what the names of all of the projects that our users are going to create or the names of their own user accounts are going to be. So that information is created on the fly. Every single time someone registers an account, they create a new user in our database. And of course, they can fill in all of their unique information for that. But what about information that we only ever want to stay the exact same? And a great example of this is a list of categories. So in Kickstarter, you're able to search for projects by categories. And when you publish a project, you're required to add a category to that. And so these are our categories here that we're going to reference today. But of course, when it comes to these categories, these don't need to be created on the fly by our users. Instead, I, as the admin of my application, would just like to create the list of categories that someone can select from. Now, why on earth would I want full control over creating this list? I'm glad you asked. As much as we love our users, unfortunately, we cannot trust them when it comes to building out our application. Because as you'll notice with my list of categories here, these are all spelled pretty much the exact same. And what I mean by that is they all have a capital letter at the beginning of them. And as you can see, there's no duplicates in this list. However, if we were to allow our users to create this list of categories on the fly, some people might spell art with a lowercase letter, but the word design with a capital. They might even make typos, so it could be design, not design. Or they might just add duplicates. So someone might add design and someone might spell design with a lowercase letter. And so this is where things get messy, and this is why we want complete control over this. What I'm going to do is fix these up here, as well as the word art. And so what I'm trying to get at here is that this list here is information I already want to store in my database. I don't need my users to create this. I, as the admin, am going to create this. So an option set is like a data type that already exists. So if I jump back over to my bubble editor and open up my data tab, what you'll notice over on the right hand side here is the menu known as our option sets. Now look, if my example was quite confusing for you, I'd recommend checking out this tutorial that Bubble has provided as well. I assure you my feelings will not be hurt, but if you're up to speed, what we're going to do is skip this tutorial. And what you might notice is that when it comes to creating an option set, it looks kind of similar to the process of creating a data type. So we need to add in a new type on the left-hand side, and that's exactly what we need to do here. And so I'm going to create a option set list called a category. And then similarly to our data types, on the right-hand side, we now need to add in the data fields for the data type. And so in our option set list, this is where we're just going to add all of those options. So all of the options I've listed out here. So there's art, design, film, fashion, games. And look, this is just the list that I've created, but feel free to add in any different categories you want based on the type of Kickstarter clone you would like to create. But for now, I'm just going to jump into Bubble and quickly type all these out. So there was art, design, film, fashion, games, music, photography, publishing, technology, and theater. And look, I apologize if I've just completely whizzed through this, but these are all of the options inside of my list here. In fact, I'm going to tick those off now that I've added those in. But this is all we need to do for our option set list. Thankfully, in our tutorial today, this is a pretty simplified version of using option sets, but it's just important to point this out because in a moment, one of our data fields that we create is going to reference this list of options. So let's jump back into our data types, back to where we were before I confused the hell out of you. And if we open up our Notion checklist, we're going to scroll right to the top and start to build out all of the data fields that sit within our first data type, which of course is our user data type. So every single time someone registers a user account, I want to store information about that person. So there's their name, their profile photo, their bio, their shipping address. So that way, if they ever purchase a reward and it's something physical that we have to send them, we know where to send that. Then the list of people that they're following and the list of people who follow them. So let's jump into Bubble and add all of those fields. We're going to open up our user data type and we're going to create a new field. And we're going to call this the name field. And what you'll notice is that in Bubble, you have the ability to determine what type of information you want to store this name as. So if we scroll down, we can store this as text, a number, a date, a file, a yes/no value, an image, or even a geographic address. There's so many different ways you can store this information, but thankfully ours is going to be the most simple option, which is just text, because a name is going to be written as text. I'll create this here. Then for the next data field, I'm going to call this the profile photo. Now, something I should point out is that you may have noticed when it comes to the spelling of this, I haven't added a space between these two words. Instead, I've used a dash. Now, that was intentional. So when it comes to my data fields, I like to add a dash between these two words because I can easily tell these apart from my data types, which had spaces. And look, it's just small things like this that are going to make your life easier as you go to build your application later on. But that's just a bit of a pro tip if you are relatively new to Bubble. Now for this field type, for a profile photo, we're obviously going to store this as an image. I'll choose to create this. Now something we're also going to do is upload a default image for our users. So what that means is that when someone registers an account, by default, they obviously won't have actually taken the time to upload a profile photo when they first register their account. Instead, they can do something like that on the settings page. But what I want to do is make sure that even when users haven't taken the time to upload a profile photo, there's still an image that can display in the placeholder where the profile photo should be. And that image is just going to be something like a small avatar. Now, when it comes to this image, I've actually taken the time to upload this into a drive for you. So I'm going to add a link in the description of this video. But inside of this drive, I just have a couple of the different assets I'm going to use in our tutorial today. So there's a Kickstarter logo, but here is a user avatar. So feel free to download this. And this is the exact image that I'm about to upload here. So for the default value, I'll select to upload this from my local device, and you will just need to do the same. From here though, we can create another field, and this is going to be the bio. So this is going to store the information about this person's profile. And this field type will just be text. Once again, that is super straightforward. Then there was going to be the shipping address. So this is the actual geographic address that we can send someone's reward to once a project has launched. So for this field type, if we scroll all the way down to the bottom, we're going to reference that this should be a geographic address, which will allow us later on to integrate with Google Maps. So that way we can store a real world address inside of that. I'll then choose to create this. And finally, there were two last data fields which are relatively the same. There is the followers. So this is obviously just going to determine who follows this particular user. Now for this field type, what I want to do is store this as a list of users. And this is where you'll really start to see the power of Bubble's database come to life. In Bubble, you can actually link data fields to separate data types. Now, in actual coding, this is what's known as a relational database. But if that confuses you, please don't stress. Essentially, what we're just doing is creating a link between our data field and our separate data type. So for the field type here, if I want to store a list of users within the people who follow someone, I'm going to reference our user data type, and I'm going to tick this option here to make this a list with multiple entries. So every single time someone follows a person, I'm going to add them to this overall list. I'll choose to create that. And then similarly, when someone actually follows someone else, I'm going to add that to the list of people that they're following. So I'm going to create a field here, and I'm going to call this following. And this will also just be a list of users. So for the field type, we're going to select our user data type, and we're going to tick that this should be a list with multiple entries. And now that's everything we need to add for our user data type. So we're going to jump back into our Notion checklist, tick that off, scroll on down, and the next data fields we're going to build out are within our project. So every single time someone creates a Kickstarter project, we're going to store some information here. So if we jump into Bubble, we're going to open up the project data type. And the very first data field is going to be the title. So this is like the name of the project. And of course, this field type is just going to be text. I'll create this. And then the next data field is going to be called the subtitle. So this is where they can add some additional information on top of the title. And once again, this is just going to be text. It's super straightforward. And now for the next field, we're going to call this the category. And this is where we're going to reference our option set list that we had previously created. So every single time a project is created, I want to be able to store a relevant category to that. So for this field type, I'm actually going to link this to my option set list. So it's going to be a category. And look, personally, I only want there to be one category for each project. So I'm not going to select that this should be a list. I'm just going to make it a singular item. I can then create that there. Then for the next two fields, I'd like to store the end date of this campaign. So when the fundraising closes. And then also when the creator of this project thinks that the actual project itself is going to launch. So the launch date. So let's create a field here. And I'm going to call this the campaign end date. And for this field type, if I scroll on down, this is just going to be a date. I'll create this. Then I'm going to create another field known as the target launch date. So this is the date in which the project will launch to the general public and everyone will receive their rewards. And this field type is going to be, once again, a date. I will create that. Then from here, we're going to determine the funding goal. So this is how much money someone is hoping to raise for this Kickstarter project. And for this field type, this will need to be a number. So if you ever want to perform a calculation or display a number, I would recommend using the number data type here. So I'm going to create that. Now, in the same vein, when it comes to the funding goal, what I also want to reference is the funding amount that this project has already received. So later on, we can perform a calculation and calculate the exact percentage of how much has been raised for the funding target. So what I'm going to do is create a field here, and I'm going to call this funded amount. And this field type will be a number as well. I'll create that. Now, another thing I'd like to store is just going to be the thumbnail image for this project. So this is the image we're going to display on our homepage whenever we want to show this project. And of course, because this is an image, this field type will also be an image. It's super straightforward. We can create this. I also want to register how many views this project receives. So every single time someone opens up the page to view this overall project, I just want to increase the view count. So later on, we can display some analytics to the project creator and just let them know how many people are viewing their project so they can see how popular it is. So I'm going to create a field here known as views, and this field type will be a number so I can keep track of the exact amount. I'll create that there. And look, we're almost at the end of all the data fields for this data type. The next thing I want to add is a status, and this is going to be called is featured. Now, what I'm going to do here is create a way for you essentially as the admin of your app to determine which projects should be featured on the homepage of your Kickstarter build, because that's a pretty big accolade to have. And we don't just want any old project to be featured on the homepage. I want you to be able to decide. And later on, I'm going to show you how you can do that. But when it comes to the data field that's going to power that feature, we're going to create a field known as is featured. So is a project featured? Yes or no? So for this field type, we're going to scroll on down and select from the yes, no value. So it either is featured or it is not featured. Now, when I create this, I'm also going to give this a default value. So this is our field here. I'm going to set this default value to equal no. So by default, not every project will be featured. It's only later on when you go into your own database that you'll be able to update the status of a project to be yes. So you're in complete control of that. Then finally, the very last data field that I want to add in is just a connection that links this overall project data type to our project's satellite data type. So I'm going to create a field here, and I'm going to call this satellite data. Now for this field type, I'd like to link this to our project satellite. And now when I create this, we've created the analogy I explained before, where we've got our project data type. And previously we just had this kind of satellite floating around in space, but right now we've just tied a piece of string between the satellite and this data type. So these have aligned and they are now connected and they can talk to each other. So that's all we need to build out when it comes to our project. And look, this was probably one of our larger data types in terms of all of the fields that we had to add. So let's jump back into Notion and tick those off and keep scrolling down through our list. The rest of these are pretty straightforward, to be honest. So inside of our satellite for our project, this is where we're going to store a lot of the heavier information. So there's things like the featured video, the campaign description, and the list of all of the rewards. And so we're going to jump into our bubble editor and add those in. So let's open up our project satellite here. And the very first data field is going to be called the featured video. And for this field type, I'm going to set this to be a file because I'm going to allow someone to upload a video file and store that here. So this is why it's a very large data field. I'll choose to create that. Then I'm going to create another field, and this is going to be called the campaign description. And thankfully, this field is relatively straightforward. We're just going to store this as text. I'll create that. But I also just want to create another field known as the rewards. And I'm going to link this to our project reward data type, but I just want to also store that as a list. So for our field type here, I'm going to reference the project reward, and I'm going to tick that this should be a list with multiple entries, because of course, for every project, there should be multiple different tiers of rewards. And so that way, the people who back our project can select which reward tier they want. I'll then choose to create that. And that is all of the data fields that will sit within this data type. So we can jump back into Notion, highlight those and tick those off, and we can now move on to the project reward. And once again, this is pretty straightforward. All we have is the title, the description, the image, and the price. So this is just going to determine each of the project reward tiers. So let's jump into Bubble, open up our project reward, and the first data field was the title, which of course is text. It doesn't get much easier than that. Then there was the description. Now, the project reward description is usually relatively small in comparison to a campaign description. So that's why I haven't broken this out into a satellite data type. But for this field, of course, it's just going to be a text type as well. Then for each reward, I also just want to store an image. So this is going to be like the thumbnail image for the reward, just so it shows a visual representation of what someone is going to get when they pledge or back and choose that specific reward. Now, because we're storing an image, of course, the field type will also be an image. That one's nice and easy too. And finally, there is the price of this particular reward tier. And of course, the person who creates this project will be able to determine that price. Now, because we want to store a number, we're going to scroll on down and select that this should be a number and create that there. Then from here, we will jump into Notion, highlight these, tick those data fields off, and look, there is only 3 more data types left, and these are super small as well. Let's head to our pledge. So every single time someone backs a project, I just want to create a record of that in my database, so that way I can relay that information to a user. So if you ever went to a user's profile, you could see what projects you backed in the past, and that way you can keep track of where all of those campaign rewards are going to come from and how much you've spent in our platform. So for this data type, I've just added some information like the total amount you've paid for each pledge, so how much you're funding or backing the project, the original project that this pledge was linked to, as well as then which reward you selected from that project, and then the quantity in which you've selected of that reward. So users can buy multiple of a particular reward if they want, particularly if it's something like a physical product where you might want to buy more than one. So let's jump into Bubble, open up our pledge data type, and the first field was going to be called the total amount. So this is the total amount that someone has spent for this pledge or this transaction. And this is going to be a number. We can create that. I'm then going to add the selected reward. So this will determine which reward someone has selected, as the name would suggest. Now this is going to be linked to our project reward data type because I'm obviously storing a reward. And I do not want this to be a list of multiple entries because one person should only be able to pledge for one reward at a time. Of course, if they want to buy multiple tiers of rewards, they can come back and then make another transaction. But for each transaction in my build today, I only want to store one reward inside of that. But the thing is, as well, is that we can also store the quantity in which someone has selected. Now, I've just got a small typo there. But if, let's say, there was a project where they're creating something like a board game, and one of the rewards is that you receive the actual final board game, you could select that the quantity could be 2, 5, or 10, depends how many board games you want to buy. But this field type should also be a number. So that way later on, we can multiply the price of the project by the quantity of how many someone has purchased, and that will give us our total amount. So you can see where all of these numbers are going to come into play. And the very last thing I just want to determine is which project someone has backed inside of this pledge. So I'm going to create a data field. Now I'm going to call this the original project, but I'm just going to abbreviate this as OG project. And for this field type, I'm going to link this to an individual project, not a list of projects. And this is just going to later on determine where each individual backing or funding or pledge has gone inside of our app. So if the owner of a project goes to a dashboard page, they can see all of the pledges that have been published against their project. So that's why this field is so important. Let's jump back into Notion, highlight those data fields, tick those off, and there's 2 left. The next ones are just related to our post. So every single time the creator of a project wants to post a status update, I'm personally just going to call this a post. You can call this something different if you'd like, but the data fields here are relatively straightforward. I just want to store the name or the title of that post. And then when it comes to the actual content of the post itself, so the written post, that's going to be stored in our satellite data type. I've got this field known as the content, as well as the likes. So it's going to store a list of users. But I also want to link a post to an original project. So that way when we have a project page, I can display a list of posts that belong to that project. And then of course, we're going to create a link between our satellite data type and our main data type here. So let's jump into Bubble, open up our post data type, and the first field we'll create is the title of this. Now for this field type, once again, a title is just going to be text. It doesn't get any easier than that. I'll then create another field known as the OG project, so we can link this post back to a project. And of course, the field type will just be a project. So we're creating a link between our separate data type once again. And then finally, we're just going to create a link between our satellite data. So for this field type, it will be the post satellite. And I'm going to choose to create that. We'll jump back into Notion, tick these 3 fields off, and the last 2 data fields we need to add are within our post satellite. So let's open this up, and this first field is going to be called content. So this is the actual contents of the post itself. So this is all of the written text, which can be quite large. So this field type is going to be a text type. I'll create this. And then there's going to be another field known as the likes, and this is going to be a list of users. So for the field type, I'm going to select that this is a user, and I will tick that this will be a list with multiple entries because multiple people can like a single post. I can then choose to create that. And that is all of the data fields we need to add out when it comes to creating our own Kickstarter database. Now look, I know this kind of rambled on for a very long time, but if you were building this out in traditional code, I can assure you it would take you twice as long. And it's kind of crazy that we were able to create all of this without even having to touch a single line of code. So Bubble makes it as easy as possible to build a visual version of a database. Although on the back end, from what you can't see, you have in fact just created a fully functional relational database, as I mentioned before. There is just one last thing I want to point out though before we wrap up this module, and that is under our data types here. You might notice under our user data type specifically, we have this text here that mentions there is privacy rules applied to this by default, whereas we don't have this on all of our new data types that we've created. Now, if I click on this, it's going to take me through to my privacy menu, and it's going to show me this privacy rule that Bubble adds by default. Now, what does this privacy rule mean? Essentially, if we look at this rule, it just means that when someone publishes information inside of our Kickstarter clone, they are the only person who can view that information. So if you were to create a project, you're the only person who can view it right now. It would not be displayed on my homepage, even though it is stored in my database. I wouldn't be able to see it, so I couldn't back your project. So this is a pretty useless privacy rule that we need. Now, things like this are great for internal tools where you only want your individual users to see the data that they create. But when it comes to building something like a marketplace, like a Kickstarter or a crowdfunding platform, you do not want this privacy rule. So what we need to do is select this little trash icon and delete that. And if you don't delete this, when you go to run a preview of your app, you're not going to see any information at all. So please, please, please take the time to do this now. And I beg you not to be that person who slides into my DMs or my emails and says, Lachlan, your tutorial didn't work, my app isn't showing data. Then after a while, I'll jump into your bubble editor and I will say, no, it is your fault because you did not watch my tutorial properly. And as you can say, I say that with conviction because it happens more often than you would imagine. So please don't be another statistic. But look, at this point in time, I'm very happy with everything we've created right now. This concludes everything we needed to build when it comes to setting up our own Kickstarter database. After taking the time to set up and configure our database, what we can now do is scroll on down to the list of features that we're going to build out throughout our tutorial today. And look, this is an incredibly long list. There's so much that we need to cover within our Kickstarter clone. But right at the top, what I want to do is focus on a pretty important feature, which is just building out the homepage of Kickstarter itself. Now, thankfully, this homepage isn't too complex. There's not a whole lot happening on it. And it's definitely a great starting point if you are relatively new to Bubble. So what I want to do before we open up our Bubble editor is just quickly open up a separate tab here, which has the real world Kickstarter product. Now, if we look at this homepage, I can see that there is quite a few things happening. Mainly, when I look at this page, I can determine that this is kind of broken down into two separate sections. So in the first section at the top here, we've got this navigation menu. Now there's quite a bit inside of this navigation menu. So that's everything that sits above this line that you see here. So we've got our Kickstarter logo, a search bar, some navigation options, and then below that we have a list of categories which will also power a navigation or a search feature. And then below that in the second half of the page, we've got some static text here. So this is just some text that's not going to change. And then we've also got these number counters here. So this just displays some of the stats that are stored inside of your Kickstarter database. And then below that, we have a list of featured projects. And so right now in this specific module, I'm actually just going to focus on everything below this line. I have a dedicated section in a moment, which is going to explain how we can build out this entire navigation menu. And the reason I've broken that into a separate module is because, as you can see, there's quite a bit involved in it. So I want to make sure I don't rush over anything and I walk you through everything you need to know in as much detail as I can. But right now we're going to focus on, as I said, the bottom half of this page. So we're going to start by adding these text elements onto our page, as well as these number counters, and then a list of all of the featured projects. So let's jump over into our Bubble editor. Now, of course, at this point in time, the only thing we've done is that we've just taken the time to configure our database. We haven't done anything else when it comes to the design aspect of this project. So what we're going to do is open up the default page that Bubble has added into our editor. Now, this is known as the index page. So if I was to open up my page drop-down menu, you'll see that every application you create comes with an index page. This is the default page that will be displayed whenever a user loads your application. So this is the home page. And before we can add any elements onto this page, we have to take care of a bit of housekeeping. So if you double click on the page, you're going to see this menu come up. And this is what's known as the property editor inside of Bubble. So as the name would suggest, this is where you can edit all of these settings for any property that you would like. Now, a property is essentially just a fancy way of saying an element. So right now I've double clicked on my page, so I can see that this is the index page. This is the index element. And within your property editor, you'll notice you have three different tabs. There's the appearance tab. So this is where you can change the cosmetic look and feel of any element you need. Then there's the layout tab. And this is what I'm going to touch base on in a second. But this allows you to create a truly responsive experience because it updates how your elements are positioned in the layout of your app. And then there's your conditional tab. So that's how you can change the way things look to particular users. Now look, I'm not going to get too ahead of ourselves right now. We don't need to focus on that. The one thing we do need to touch base on before we add any elements to our page though is the layout. So when it comes to a layout inside a Bubble, when you're creating a fully responsive app, the first thing you need to do is give your overall page a container layout. Now what does the container layout mean? If you kind of think of it, your page is like one of those Tupperware containers. You're going to store lots of different elements on it. So any buttons, text, images, or even posts or projects in this case, these are all going to sit inside of that one Tupperware container. So that's why the page is known as a container. Now the layout just determines in which order and position your elements that sit inside of this container will be displayed. And what do I mean by that? If I open up this drop-down menu, you're going to see 4 different options. But please don't stress, I'll only ever choose between one of 2 options. There's the row and the column. But what on earth does the row and the column actually mean? Essentially, these options just determine if elements will be displayed vertically down your page or horizontally across it. So in a great example here, if I was to select the column option, what this means is that it's going to stack any elements you add onto your page from the top down. So I'm going to select this option here and I'll show you a quick example. So if I head to my visual elements and just add 2 buttons onto my page, and you don't need to do this, I'm going to delete these in a second, but I just want to illustrate my point. So if I just double click on my page again, open up my layout tab, you'll see that because the container layout is set as a column, these 2 elements are stacked on top of each other. So they're stacked vertically down my page. Whereas if I was to select the row option, what you'll now notice is that these are stacked horizontally. So that's the difference between these 2 options. Now, when it comes to the overall page of our Kickstarter clone today, although we do have elements that are positioned horizontally across our page, when you look at the actual page structure itself, everything is stacked from the top down. And look, most modern applications are built like this. So we've got text at the top, below that we have more text, then below that we've got this section, and although this section here is stacked horizontally inside of it, the actual section sits below the text above it, and so on. So that's why today we're going to set the container layout to be a column. And look, if I can be completely transparent, when it comes to every single overall page inside of Bubble, I will always select the column option. There's not really any use cases where you'd make your overall page a row. I will show you, as I mentioned, how we can make certain sections a row in a moment, but the overall page itself should be stacked from the top down. So from here, what we need to do is add in our very first element, and that's going to be this static text, which is super simple. Let's jump into Bubble. I'm going to delete my 2 buttons here. I'm going to head to my visual elements and I'm going to grab a text element and add this onto my page. And when it comes to this text, we're going to display the words, bring a creative project to life, full stop. Now for this text, I'd like to make it slightly larger so it matches the same style as the real world text here. So back in Bubble, what I'm going to do is scroll on down and I'm not going to update the style of this. Now look, I will touch base on styles in a moment, but for this text here, I only want to create a one-off version. And what do I mean by that? Essentially, if I was to change the font here, so the size, the color, or the position, I only want that change to be applied to this specific text here. I'm not going to reference those same design settings anywhere else in my app. So I'm just going to create a one-off style. So in order to do that, I'm just going to detach the style. And look, this is super simple. I'm just going to set the font size here to be 36 pixels. I'm going to align this text in the center. And that is how I can update the appearance of this text. But what I need to do is make sure it's aligned in the center of my page and it's fully responsive. So what I'm going to do is jump over into my layout tab here. And by default, Bubble has actually made this text element fully responsive, which is a great thing for us. And how do I know that? Good question. In your layout tab, you'll notice that there's some settings here known as the width and the height of this element. Now, by default, this width here has a minimum width of 0 pixels and a maximum width of infinite pixels. Now, what does that mean? That means that if the page shrinks down, this text element will continually shrink right down to 0 pixels, which is absolutely nothing. And if the page expands, the maximum width is infinite. So it will continually expand out with the page. And perhaps the best way to illustrate that is by actually opening up our responsive tab here. So if I just close my property editor, what you'll notice is that when I reduce the width of my page here, this text element is automatically going to be responsive because the minimum width is set to 0 pixels. So it will continually shrink. One thing I've noticed though, back in my UI builder, is that under the layout tab, by default, this checkbox is ticked here to fit the width of this element to the content inside of it. So as you can see right now, this cuts off at the very last bit of text inside of this element. Now there's nothing wrong with that, but just a personal preference I have when I'm building a Bubble is that I just want to see this text element take up the entire width of the page. So I'm going to uncheck this option. And what you'll now notice is that because there's no restriction on the maximum width, so because the element is not fitting the width to the content inside of it, it's going to expand across the full page, which means that my text will automatically be positioned in the center, regardless of where the page is. So as my page expands out here, it's going to be in the center, and as it shrinks down, it's also going to be in the center. So this is how you can create a truly responsive experience inside of Bubble. And this is something that is really important for you to remember. In order to make your app fully responsive, set the minimum width to 0 and the maximum width to infinite. Now, of course, there is going to be exceptions to this, which I'll explain as we cross that bridge later in our tutorial. But please, 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 if you take anything away from this first module in my course today, it's this. You're going to hear me mention these settings time and time again throughout our build today. So this is super important to highlight. If we then also jump back to our UI builder, what I'd like to do is head to our layout tab once again and just add some margins around this text element, because right now I can see it's touching the borders of my page. And when it comes to the margins here, I'm going to add 30 pixels of margin at the top, 20 on the left and 20 on the right. And now that's just going to ensure that when my page shrinks in size, the text will never touch the borders of the page. So this is how, once again, you can enhance the end user experience. Now look, that is the very first text element we needed to add. It was super straightforward. Let's add a second text element below this. So we're going to head to our visual elements once again, grab a new text element. And for this text element, I'm going to write all of this out in caps. It's going to display on Kickstarter with a semicolon, and I can see I have a typo there. And when it comes to this text, I'm once again going to detach the default style because I'm just going to update the font size to be 16. I'm then also going to align this text in the center of the element, and then I'm going to jump over to my layout tab and once again make this fully responsive, which it is by default, but I just want to uncheck that I should fit the width of this element to the content inside of it. While we're in our layout tab, I'm also going to set the top margin to be 20, the left margin to be 20, and the right margin to be 20. And as you can now see, that's not touching the existing text element above it or the borders of my page. Now, when it comes to the element below this, this is where things are going to start to get interesting. Over in the real world Kickstarter product here, as you can see, we've got this section which is positioned horizontally across our page. So we've got almost like 3 different groups here that are all combined together and are stacked across our page. So how can we stack something horizontally in a row container layout if our overall page is a column? So it's stacked vertically. Thankfully, Bubble allows you to easily do this using what's known as a group element. So if I scroll all the way down to my containers elements here, I'm going to grab a group and add this onto my page. Now, a group, as the name would suggest, allows you to group elements inside of it. So it's also known as a container. The best way to explain what groups are is that they're kind of like mini pages that sit inside of your overall page. So they have all the exact same functionality as a full page. So you can store elements inside of them, you can add conditions on them, you can store data in them, which I'll get there later on. But the beautiful thing about groups is you can update the container layout. So any elements I add inside of this group, I can choose whether they should be stacked vertically or horizontally. So for this group here, I'm actually going to set the container layout to be a row. So that means anything I add inside of this is going to be stacked horizontally across my page. Now, while I'm working inside of Bubble, a personal preference of mine is that when I add any group into my actual editor, I just like to head over to the Appearance tab, detach the default style, and give this a solid background color. And I'm going to start by making this one a light shade of red. Now, of course, when we go to preview or publish our app, we don't want this to be a bright red color. We can always come back and remove this to be none later on. But while we're actually building our app out, it allows you to actually see where all of the groups sit on your page. Because in order to create a truly responsive experience, what you'll find is that it's common practice to break your page down into a bunch of different groups. And if you can't easily determine where these groups are sitting on your page, it's going to get overwhelming really quick. I personally think that when you color code your groups, it kind of makes it look like you're just building with Lego blocks. So you can see where you're stacking elements inside of your app. So as I said, for this group, I'm going to set the background color to be red. And so inside of this group, what I'm also then going to do is add another series of groups, which look, already sounds confusing, I know. But the reason we need to add more groups into this existing group is because if I look at this overall group, so this entire rectangle here, I like to think that it's got 3 different sections inside of it. And these 3 sections are also individual groups. And as you can see, inside of these individual groups, we have 2 text elements that are stacked on top of each other, so vertically. So what we would need to do is add another group inside of our existing group and set its container layout to be a column. And then we can easily just repeat that process 3 times and it will stack them all across our page nicely. So let's jump back into Bubble. We're going to grab another group and add this into our red group. And this is where it's important to start color coding your groups because things can quickly get confusing. Now, something I'm going to do to this particular group, so it's currently called Group B, that I did not do to my red group is actually update the name of this. So if you select at the top of your property editor, you'll see that you can update the naming convention for any element. So I'm going to call this group Projects Funded because inside of this group, I'd like to display how many projects have been funded in our Kickstarter clone. Now, the reason I'm doing that is because when I click away, and then if I was to click back, although it looks like I've clicked on my red group, as you can see, I've actually clicked on my new group that I've added inside of this, which currently does not have a solid background color. So this is once again the importance of updating the background color of your groups because you can't actually see this right now. So what we need to do while we're here is, of course, head down to our styling, detach the default style. I'm going to give this background style a flat color, and I'm going to make this a shade of green this time so I can easily differentiate between the existing group. I'm also going to give this a solid border because later on when we remove the color of this, I'd like it to kind of break down with some lines around it. I'm then going to jump over to my layout tab here. And for the container layout, I'm going to leave this as the default option, which is a column. Because if you remember, I said that we were going to stack 2 elements vertically inside of this. But one thing I'd like to do is come on down to our width settings. So by default, at this point in time, a group, when you add it into your editor, will not have a minimum width of 0. It will have a minimum width of 280. Now, look, I am happy to leave that as it is for now, and I'll explain why in a moment. But one thing I'm really interested in doing while I'm here is giving this a maximum width. So right now, because the maximum width is set as infinite, this green group is taking up as much space as it possibly can on my page. Now, I don't want that to be the case. Instead, I only want it to take up a certain amount of size, as you can see, because I need to add more room for my additional groups. So what I'm going to do is actually set the maximum width to be something like 400 pixels. Now look, there's no scientific reason why I selected 400 pixels. I think that that's just more than enough to add all of the text that I'm going to need to add into this group. And look, we will come back and play around with some of these layout settings in a moment. But before we do that, what I'd like to do is add my 2 text elements into this group. So if we look at this, what I need to do is perform a search in my database and calculate how many projects have been funded within my Kickstarter clone, and then just type in the text projects funded below that. So if I scroll on up here in my elements tree, I'm going to grab a text element. I'll add this into my green group. And what I'm going to do is not type in static text, but instead I'm going to use this option to insert dynamic data. Now the word dynamic is something you're going to hear time and time again throughout our tutorial today. And this truly is where Bubble has its superpowers. So the difference between static and dynamic is that static text is text that does not change. So for instance, this word projects funded, it will always say projects funded. Whereas this dynamic text here, it's a number that updates every single time a project gets funded. And so it's dynamic, it's going to change, it's fluid. And that is where Bubble has its superpowers. Essentially, what you're able to do is create a dynamic application for every individual user inside of your app. So no 2 users could potentially see the same app. It could be unique to them. And when you think about it, that's the same as every real modern application you use in this day and age. So if you're using something like Instagram, the feed you see is completely different to the feed I would see because it's dynamic, it's tailored to your preferences. And so Bubble allows you to create that entire experience. Now, thankfully, this is pretty straightforward to display this dynamic text. What we're going to do is insert dynamic data, and we're going to perform a search in our database for all of the projects. And inside of this, I just like to add a search filter, which is known as a constraint, because I only want to search for the projects where the funded amount, so how much money they've received, is in fact greater than the number 0. So I'm just going to type in 0 and then click away. And then what I'd like to do is after this search has run, I'd like to perform a count on how many projects meet this search requirement. So if there's no projects in my database that have received any funding, this will return the count of 0. Whereas if, let's say, there's 100 projects that have received anything greater than $0, so $1 or more, it will display the number 100. And that's all we need to change here. That was pretty straightforward. Now, while we're here, I'm also going to scroll on down because we're going to detach the default style. I'm going to set the font size to be 30. I will align this text in the center, and I'm going to update the font color to be a shade of green here. If you'd like this color code, it's 037362. I'm then going to jump over to my layout tab and make sure this element is fully responsive the way I like it. So I can see it is responsive because the minimum width is 0 and the maximum width is infinite. But I'm going to uncheck this option to fit the width of this element to the content inside of it. And that's just going to make sure it spans across the entire width of my green group that it sits within. And while we're in our layout tab, I'm going to add 20 pixels of margin at the top, none on the bottom, but 20 on the left and 20 on the right. And here's just a pro tip for you in Bubble. If you want to get a real idea of what this is going to look like when you run a preview of your app, over in the Appearance tab, instead of displaying the actual expression, so the expression in Bubble is just the words or the dynamic text you've added in here. What you can do is select in this canvas placeholder field and you can add in a fake value. So if I wanted to add, let's say, the same value as the real world Kickstarter project here, I could just copy this and I could paste this in. And as you'll see inside of my editor, it's now going to display that exact value. Now, when you run a preview of your app, this placeholder will not be there. It will just display the actual value of the count you performed in your database. But this just gives you a good idea of what this is going to look like. Now, below this dynamic text element, we're going to add another text element. And this one's going to be pretty straightforward because it's just some static text. So this just displays the words projects funded. So let's go ahead and type that in. Now for this text, I'm going to scroll on down once again, detach the default style, and I'm going to set the font size to be 16. I will align this in the center. Then I'll jump over to my layout tab and update the responsive settings. Once again, I'm happy with the minimum and maximum width here, but I'm going to uncheck that this should fit the element to the content inside of it. And when it comes to our margins, I'm going to add 10 pixels of margin at the top. Because this is the last element that's going to sit inside of my group, I'm going to add 20 pixels of margin on the bottom, then 20 on the left and 20 on the right. And thankfully, that is everything we need to add inside of our first group. Now look, when it comes to our two remaining groups here, thankfully we actually don't need to rebuild those from scratch. We can just make a copy of our existing green group. So if we select on this green group, which is our group projects funded, I'm going to make a copy of this. I'm then going to select inside of my red group, and I'm going to make a pasted version. Now, as you'll see, it's copied across absolutely everything. So it saves us having set up the layout settings, the background color, and everything else. What we will need to do though is of course update the dynamic value. But first of all, I'd just like to update the name of this group. I'm going to call this group Total Funds because we're going to display how much funding users have actually pledged inside of our Kickstarter clone. I'm then also going to jump over to my Appearance tab. And just to separate these two groups from each other, I'm going to scroll on down and set the background style here to be a flat color of blue. So now you can see where our two groups sit next to each other. It doesn't just look like one continuous group. And then what we need to do is update the text that's going to be displayed inside of this group here. So what we're going to do is double click on our first bit of dynamic data. Now, of course, if you remember, because we copied across, this is searching for a list of projects that have been funded. Now, what I'd like to do is kind of create a continuation from this search. So if I open up this search, if you remember, it's searching for projects where the total funded amount is greater than 0. But what I'd like to do is pull from all of those products where the funding is greater than 0. I'd like to pull the total amount of funding that they have all received and calculate the total sum of that. So the total number collectively together. So what I'm going to do is close this and just hit backspace and remove the operator known as count. So the operator is the thing we're doing on that search. Because what I'd like to do is scroll on down here and I want to reference each item's funded amount. So what this means is that for every project that has received more than $0 in funding, it's going to pull every single one of their items' funded amount. And after pulling out the total funded amount for each project, I'm going to scroll on down once again and calculate the total sum of that. So the sum is the collective amount. Now that's going to return a number. So if there is, let's say, $10,000 that's been raised across 10 projects, that will display the number 10,000. However, I want this to be formatted in dollars. So I'm going to choose to format this as, and I'm going to update this from a number to now be a currency. I'm going to set a 1,000 separator as a column, and I'm going to set the currency here as dollars, just because that's what I'm going to use. If you want to use something like euros or pounds, feel free to do that, but I'm going to go with dollars. I'm then going to choose to close this, and that would do exactly what we need. However, there is something that we just need to factor in. When it comes to a search like this, where you're referencing data fields, if there is $0 that has been raised across any project, this isn't actually going to display the number 0. It's just going to be blank. So what I want to do is just create like a safety blanket in a way that just makes sure that at the beginning of our app, when no money has been raised, it just displays the number 0 with a dollar sign. Because look, that's going to be much better than just displaying an empty space. So if we scroll on down once again, and I know that this expression is getting a little bit on the long side here, what we're going to do is just type in the word defaulting to. Now what this means is that if this value is not valid, it's going to just display whatever we type in here. So I'm going to type in a dollar sign followed by the number 0. I'll hit enter. And now that's automatically going to display $0 if there is no funding amount. Now what we can also do is update our canvas placeholder. So I'm just going to copy this very long number that Kickstarter has in this field. And as you'll see, this is what it's going to look like inside of our application. Obviously, it's going to take a lot of years to get to $8 billion, but that doesn't mean you can't shoot for the stars. Let's start now, and we'll eventually get there. The next thing I just want to update is the static text, which if we look at the real world Kickstarter product, it just displays the words towards creative work. So let's jump back into Bubble and update this towards creative work. Perfect. And that's all we need to change for our second group. So when it comes to our third group, let's make another copy of this existing group, select in my red group and paste this in. Now for this group, the first thing I'm going to do is update the naming convention. I'm going to call this group pledges because this group here displays how many pledges people have made. And of course, we'll need to update the background color. So I'm going to set the flat background color to be a shade of, let's say, yellow in this case. So I can easily determine these three groups apart from each other. And of course, we can now update the dynamic data. Now look, thankfully, this one is going to be fairly straightforward. I'm just going to right click in this field and clear all of this data. We're going to start again from scratch. And in this case, we're going to insert dynamic data and we're going to once again perform a search in our database. This time though, for all of the pledges. And I don't need to add any constraints here because I just want to calculate or count how many actual pledges have been created in our database. So if I select the more option, I'm just going to get the count. Then we can also update our canvas placeholder. So let's go and copy this big number here, jump back into Bubble, update that there. And then when it comes to the static text, we can update this to display the word pledges. And now that is all we need to add inside of these three groups that sit horizontally across my page. However, there is still a few minor settings that we need to change. So right now, first of all, I can see that this entire group, so the red group that had the row container layout, so the group that stores my three individual groups, it's currently touching the borders of my page. So we need to add some margins around that. But before we get there, we also need to update some individual settings for each of these groups. So if I select on our first group here, so our group pledges on the right-hand side, and head over to my layout tab, just a personal preference of mine is that when I'm building with groups, I always like to make sure that after I've added all of my elements inside of it, that I set the minimum height to be 0. Now look, that's not really going to change the way things look inside of my app, but it's just a good practice to start putting in place when you start with Bubble. And why do I do this? Essentially, it just means that it's going to collapse the height of this group to fit the height of all of the content inside of it. So let's say if a group had a minimum height of 200 pixels, this just means that at its smallest possible size, it will need 200 pixels, which is this height you see here. Whereas if I set the minimum height to 0, by default, it's automatically going to fit the height to fit perfectly around the elements inside of it. And as you can see, we've got our text elements with 20 pixels of margin at the bottom. So it's not actually going to touch those text elements itself, but they're all going to be neatly placed. So I'm going to go across and do that to every group here. I'm going to click on my second group, set the minimum height to 0. then click on my first group and set the minimum height to also be 0. Now, I did mention before that when it comes to our width settings, we would come back and update the values of the minimum widths. So previously, I told you for any other elements like a text element, if you want to make it fully responsive, you need to make sure the minimum width is 0 and the maximum width is infinite. And perhaps to illustrate my point here, what I should do is do just that. So let's go ahead and set the minimum width to be 0 for each of these groups. But we will come back and make a change to this, and it'll make a lot more sense then. So right now, these groups are completely responsive. They will shrink down to the smallest possible size, which is 0 pixels. However, if you remember, we set a maximum width of 400 pixels, just so they wouldn't all take up too much space on our page. I'm quite happy with them just taking up this small amount that we've given them. And before we make any other changes to those width settings, I'd just like to add some margins around my overall group that stores these 3 groups inside of it. So that way it doesn't touch the borders of my page. Now, of course, if I was to try and double click on that group, I can't get to it because these 3 groups take up the entire space inside of that group. So what you can actually do is open up the property editor on one of your groups that sits inside of that main group. You can then right click on that group, and if you select its first parent, so the parent is the element that is taking care of that group. So this yellow group sits inside of that red group, which was called group A. Now look, I could call this group red just so I know that this is the red group. What I would like to do is add some margins around this. So I'm going to scroll down to my margins and add 20 pixels of margin at the top, 20 on the left and 20 on the right. I'm also going to update my minimum height to be 0, and I'll do the exact same thing for the minimum width. So right now this group is fully responsive. And in fact, what we should do is jump over to our responsive tab. And if I was to expand this page out, what I can see is that my red group is now visible. And the reason for that is because if I double click on my red group here and open up my layout tab, if you remember, this container layout was set as a row because we wanted to horizontally display elements across our page. But below this container layout setting, you're going to see an option known as the container alignment. So this just determines that of all of the elements that sit inside of this overall container, so our overall red group, this will just determine where they sit. So right now, everything is aligned to the left side. If I wanted to make everything aligned to the right side, I could click this option. But what I'd like to do is align this to the center. So these will always be positioned in the center of our page. We could also update the horizontal alignment of the red group itself, just to make sure that this overall red group is also always positioned in the center of our page. So as you'll now see, as the page expands, these groups will always sit in the center. But one thing I should point out is that as we reduce the width of our page, this is where things are going to start to get ugly. So as you can see right now, all of these elements are becoming squished, or I should say these groups are squishing up against each other. Now, why is that? It's because we've set the minimum width of each group to be 0 pixels. So we told it essentially that, hey, you can go down to the smallest possible size, and that's actually not the experience we want to create. When it comes to stacking elements horizontally across your page, if you want to create a fully responsive experience, you're most likely going to want these groups to get to a point where they just stack on top of each other, instead of just trying to shrink down and take up as little space as they can. So what we can actually do is set a minimum width for this. So that will tell this group, you're not allowed to go below this certain width. And if you do, too bad. What you need to do is move down and make room on the page for yourself. But how can we determine what this exact width should be? The best way to do this is by heading up to the smallest possible dimensions that we could view our application on, and that is going to be a mobile device that is 320 pixels. Now, 320 pixels is the size of something like an iPhone 5. So if you've got users who live in the Stone Age, unfortunately, you still have to cater to those people. What I find though is that most modern devices, so something like an iPhone 15 or above, these all sit around the 400 pixel mark. So there is more room to cater to, but what you need to do is build for the smallest possible device and everything will just scale up accordingly. So at the smallest possible size, we have 320 pixels to work with. So when it comes to our overall red group, if you remember, we had 20 pixels of margin on each side of this group because we don't want this group to touch the borders of my page. So let's take 320 pixels and subtract from that 20 pixels and then subtract another 20 pixels. That's going to leave us with 280 pixels. So what I'm actually now going to do is set the minimum width of each of these groups to be 280 pixels. And as you'll see, 280 plus the margin on both sides is going to make this 320 pixels exactly. So it's going to fit beautifully on our mobile device. I'm then going to do the exact same thing for every group here. So that was my yellow group. I'm going to select my blue group and I'll set the minimum width to be 280 pixels. And then I'll do the same for my green group. We'll set that to be 280 pixels. Now watch what happens as I shrink the width of my page. When all of my three groups don't have enough space because they're being stubborn with their minimum widths, they decide to just stack on top of each other. They're not going to shrink anymore. I can then reduce this even further, and as you'll see, these will all stack on top of each other beautifully. So that is how we can create a truly responsive experience inside of Bubble. And look, to me, that is gorgeous. I absolutely love watching this in play. But thankfully, that is everything we need to build out on this section of our page. The very last thing we just need to add is the list of recommended projects or featured projects. And look, just when you started thinking you were getting the hang of Bubble, I'm going to push your skills even further. So what we're going to do is jump back to our Bubble editor. And before we add that list of projects, I'm just going to add a static text element. So I'm going to head to my visual elements. I'll grab some text. And this is just going to display the words featured projects. I can just see I have a small typo I need to fix. And for this text here, what I'm going to do is just scroll on down, detach the default style, and I'm going to make this 20 pixels in size. I'm then going to jump to my layout tab. And look, it is fully responsive by default. But as I mentioned in the past, I just like to unselect this option to fit the width of this element to the content inside of it. So that way it just stretches out across the full width of our page. I'm then going to scroll on down to my margins and add 40 pixels of margin at the top, 20 on the left and 20 on the right. And that'll just ensure it doesn't touch the borders of my page, but it's currently in line with my existing groups. Now below this, when we want to display a list of featured projects, there is a special element in Bubble that will allow you to display a list of things, and that is known as a repeating group. So if we head down to our containers menu, we're going to grab a repeating group element and add it onto our page. And this repeating group kind of just looks like a spreadsheet in a way. So as the name would suggest, a repeating group is a list of groups that continually repeat themselves. Now, as I said, if you want to display a list of anything inside a Bubble, you will need to use a repeating group element. These are going to be your best friend. They are the most powerful element in Bubble, and they allow you to create some insanely powerful features. And thankfully, they are pretty easy to set up. It's more just the design component that is a little bit challenging if you are brand new to Bubble. But look, for instance, when it comes to a repeating group, if you wanted to, let's say, rebuild a version of Instagram, where you've got your homepage feed, where you scroll through a list of posts, reels, and photos. If you wanted to build that feed yourself in Bubble, you would use a repeating group. So inside of a repeating group, as I said, it's like a group that continually repeats itself. So all you have to do is design the very first group, and Bubble will automatically populate the remaining cells or the remaining rows with data from your database. So if you were building something like an Instagram clone, you would just design how the first post would look. And then when someone loads their feed, you can automatically pull different data from your database to populate the rest of that list. So repeating groups are super powerful. Now, when it comes to a repeating group, there are a lot of different settings you need to set up. So I'm going to walk you through these. The first thing you need to do is head to your appearance tab, because with a repeating group, you need to give this a data source. So for the type of content I want to display in this repeating group, I want this to be a list of projects from my database. Then when it comes to the actual data source, I'm going to perform a search in my database for all of the projects where, first of all, the is featured status is in fact set to yes. So you, as the admin or moderator of your application, later on will have the ability to update which projects should be featured on your homepage. And I'll explain how to do that in a moment. But what I also want to do is make sure that we're only displaying projects that are currently still available to back. If a campaign's end date has finished, I don't want it to be displayed on our homepage because users shouldn't be able to back that after that end date. So what we're going to do is add an additional constraint, and we're only going to display projects where the campaign end date is in fact greater than the current date time. So if you just type in the word date, you can reference the current date time. And if you click away, that will validate. Now, when it comes to this list of projects, I'm going to update the way these are sorted and displayed in our repeating group. So I'm just going to choose to display these in a random sorting, which just means that every single time someone loads this page, it's going to be in a completely random order. So that means that any featured projects will get an even amount of distribution. And they're going to choose to close this. That's all we need to update for the data source. In my opinion, that was relatively straightforward. The more challenging part when it comes to a repeating group, as I said, is the layout and responsive settings. So what we need to do now is move on down to these next settings here. So this will just determine how many rows and how many columns there are. So right now, this repeating group is fixed at 4 rows and 1 column. So as you can see, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 rows, and there's only 1 column. So if we were searching through a list of projects in our database, there would be 4 projects stacked on top of each other. Now that's not really the experience I'm looking to create. Today, what I want to do is create something more like this section that you see here on the right-hand side. So see how these are all their own individual cards, and they're stacked beside each other and on top of each other. I want to replicate that experience. So what I'm going to do is double click on our repeating group, and I'm actually going to unselect that this should be a fixed number of rows. And the reason I'm doing that is because if you don't uncheck this, it will only display 4 entries from your database. So let's say based on this search, you had 20 featured projects that were currently available to back. Even if you have 20, Bubble's only going to display the first 4. And that's not the experience we want to create. We want to display all of those featured projects on our homepage. So I'm going to uncheck that this should be a fixed number of rows. And then I'm also going to uncheck that this should be a fixed number of columns. Now, when we're working with our repeating group, it's just going to store some random values here. And this is the part that can be a little bit confusing. Before I explain how to build and configure anything else from this point, I just want to highlight that when it comes to a repeating group, even for myself, someone who's building a bubble for absolutely years, I personally still find that getting the correct settings is just a matter of trial and error. So we're going to go back and forth between these settings multiple times, and that's completely okay. I just say this because I remember when I first started building and repeating groups, I was kind of overwhelmed with how many settings there were, and I just didn't think I was good enough to use them. But please, I assure you, it takes time to make the perfect repeating group, and I'll explain to you the exact steps I use to get there. So for the minimum height and the minimum width of each column, just for an example today, I'm going to set both of these values to be 300 pixels. Now, the reason why I select 300 pixels is because if you remember, the width of the smallest possible mobile device that someone could view this page on is 320 pixels. And so 300 pixels is kind of close to that. And I do typically add some margin on the side of my repeating groups. So that kind of just gets me in the ballpark. But what you'll see now is because these are 300 by 300, we have these perfect squares here. So these are going to be each of our projects. And you can see that these are stacked horizontally. And of course, if you had more than 3, these would also stack vertically down the page. Now, inside of each repeating group, before we can update any of the responsive settings within our layout tab, or even make any configuration changes to the size of the row, what we need to do is actually build the content out that we're going to display inside of them. Now, today, I'd like to kind of replicate this experience where when you hover over a particular project, you can see how it's got almost like this little tile here. So it contains all of the information about this project. What I want to do is make the default version of the project look like this. So I'm not going to replicate this exact hover effect, but I want each project to have its own unique tile. And in that tile, it's going to display the featured image, as well as the creator, and then even some information about this project. And so because I want to make this look like a tile, in order to structure this and organize it nicely, I'm going to actually add a group element inside of my repeating group. So once again, you're going to see here that I'm going to be stacking a series of different groups to create the exact experience that I want. So if I head over to my containers menu, I'm going to grab a group here. I'm going to add this into the first cell of my repeating group. And this is where you'll really start to see repeating groups come to life, because any changes you make here will automatically be applied to every other cell of your repeating group. So you only need to design the very first cell, and the rest will just mimic the exact same behavior. Now for this group, I'm going to scroll on down to my styling and detach the default style. I'm not going to give this a flat background color, but instead I am going to give this a solid border. So that way I still will be able to see where it sits on my page. If you really wanted to give this a flat background color, feel free to do that. There's nothing wrong with that. But I just think that if I click away, I can actually see where this group sits because it does have a solid border. And that's what's really important to me right now. Now, another thing I'll do when it comes to the border is set the roundness of this to be 10. So that way it has some curved edges. And from here, I'd like to add all of my elements that I'm going to display inside of this group. So if I scroll up, before I do that, I'm actually even going to give this group some margins. So that way it kind of just creates a more recognizable space for my cards that I'm going to add. So if I quickly just digress and open up my layout tab here, I'm going to scroll on down to my margins and just add 10 pixels across the top, the bottom, the left, and the right. And if I click away, as you'll now see, these kind of are starting to look more like those cards that I was wanting to create. Now, the first thing we need to add and display when it comes to these cards is the featured image of this project. So if we jump into Bubble, we're going to scroll on up to our visual elements, grab an image here, and we'll add this into our group. Now, what I want to do is reference the image for each individual project that sits inside of our repeating group. Now, the way you would typically do this is by inserting dynamic data. And for a repeating group, you'd see the option known as the current cells and whatever you've set the data type as. And perhaps I should actually just illustrate this by adding an image into my repeating group. You don't need to do this, but this is just an example. So if I insert dynamic data right now, I can reference the current cells project. So the current cells project is the project related to this cell of our repeating group. So if we've got 10 featured projects, in cell 1, it would display the first project in our database. In cell 2, it would display the second. In cell 3, it would display the third, and so on. So this image would only display the relevant featured image for the very first project in our database. So it would be dynamic, and there's that word again. It would change automatically to display the correct image that you need. And so what you do is just reference the current cells project, its thumbnail image in this case. That's called the featured image. However, the reason I point this out is because if I quickly delete this image here doesn't have the option. And the reason for that is because this image doesn't actually sit inside of our repeating group. It actually sits inside of a group that then sits inside of our repeating group. So what we need to do is create some sort of way to pass the data on from our repeating group into this group, which we can then reflect and use inside of this image. So if I quickly just click on this group here, and perhaps I could update the name of this to be called group tile or group card, because this just looks like one of those cards. What you'll see with groups is that, as I've mentioned before, you have the ability to store data inside of them. So what I'm going to do is set the type of content for this group to be a project. And then I can have it extract the data from the repeating group that it sits within. And then any elements that I add inside of this group can reference that data that I'm storing in the group. So for the data source, I'm just going to reference the current cells project. That's all I need to do. And now from here, if I select on my image, I can insert dynamic data and I can reference what's known as the parent groups project. Now the parent groups project is essentially the current cells project. The only difference is that because this image sits inside of the group, that group is kind of like taking care of it like a parent. So it's now known as the parent group, but it's the exact same thing. And in this case, I'm going to reference the parent group's project, its thumbnail image. And look, just a personal preference of mine, you don't need to do this, but I'm just going to choose to process this with Imgix. And what I can do is tick this option to resize and fit the dimensions by cropping them. So that just means that if this image is a small image, it's just going to expand it out and crop it off so it fits the entire space neatly. And that's everything we need to change for the dynamic data source of this image. I will, however, just like to scroll on down and detach the default style of this, because while I'm working on my images, I just like to give them a solid border. So that way, when I click away, I can actually see where the image sits inside of my editor. Of course, when you go to run a preview or publish your app, you can change that. But for now, I'm quite happy with this. I'm also then just going to make sure the roundness of the borders for this image are 10. So that way, when I expand this image out in a moment, it's going to fit the same roundness of the borders inside of my overall group. And then that brings me to my next point. What we need to do is update the dimensions of this image, because right now it's quite like a square, whereas I want it to be kind of like a narrow rectangle. So if I jump over to my layout tab, when it comes to this image, right now it's set as a fixed width. So this means it is not responsive. It is set as 320 pixels, and it will only ever be 320 pixels, no larger and no smaller. Now that's problematic because over in my responsive tab here, if I reduce the width of my screen, as you'll see, this image doesn't want to budge at all. It's always going to be this size. So when you start to reduce the page, it just cuts off. So what we need to do is make this image fully responsive. So I'm going to click on the image, open up my layout tab, and what I'm actually going to do is unselect that this should be a fixed width. If we make this fully responsive, I'm going to need to set the minimum width to be 0, and I'll set the maximum width as infinite. And if you remember, that means this image can now shrink down to the smallest possible size or expand out to the largest possible size. So it is fully responsive. But right now it's taking up quite a bit of height. So I'm going to tick this option to keep this element's aspect ratio fixed. And I'm going to set this as a 2:1 ratio, which just means that now it's going to be a perfect rectangle. Now look, after adding this image in, we can add in the details of the person who has published this project. So if I quickly just jump over to the real world Kickstarter product here, what you'll see is that below this featured image, there's just this little section which contains the user's profile photo, their name, and then below that, it's got some information about how many days are left on this campaign, as well as what percentage of it has been backed. So what you can see right now is below our featured image, there's a section stacked which actually has a couple of elements that are positioned horizontally next to each other. So they're positioned side by side. So what I'm going to do is add another group into my overall group, which is the card that we've already added into our repeating group. And inside of that, I'm just going to add the user's profile photo as well as their name. I'm going to create a relatively simplified version of this just because I don't want to overcomplicate things. But if we jump back into Bubble, what I'm going to do is scroll on down to my containers menu. I'm going to grab a group element. Now, when I add this group element onto my page, I just need to make sure I'm adding it inside of my existing group, not inside of my repeating group. So if I was to click this group on top of my image element, what you'll now see is that this new group actually does sit within the borders of my existing group. So please just double check that it's within that existing group, not within your repeating group. The way you can tell where that group sits is, of course, you can right click on it and select its first parent. So that is the element it sits within. And I can see right now that the first parent is the group card, whereas it's not the repeating group. If it's the repeating group, you haven't added it onto the page correctly. Now for this group, what I'm going to do is first of all, jump over to my appearance tab and I'm going to update the background color just because it's getting a little bit hard to see where everything sits on my page. So I'm going to detach the style here, scroll on down and set the background style to be a flat color. And I'll make this, let's say, a light shade of green. Now for this group, we're going to jump over to our layout tab because inside of this, as I said, I'm going to stack two elements side by side. There's going to be the user's profile photo and then their name. So if I want to stack elements side by side or horizontally across my page, I need to set the container layout to be a row. I'm then going to move this to the next position in my overall card group. So that way it sits directly below my image. And what we're going to do is, first of all, add in the image element, which will display the user's profile photo. And then, of course, we can come back and update any of the layout settings in a moment. But for the time being, let's scroll on up to our visual elements, grab an image here, add it into my green group. And when it comes to this image, I want this to dynamically display the user's profile photo that has created each project. So let's say if you're the person who created the first project that's being displayed inside of our list of overall projects, your profile photo should be displayed. If my project is second in the list, my profile photo should be displayed. And so that's why we can insert dynamic data and it will do just that. So I'm going to reference the parent groups thing. Now, what I can notice here is that we actually don't have the ability to reference the parent group's project. Now that's of course, once again, because this image element sits inside of a group, which sits inside of our existing group, which of course then sits inside of our repeating group. It's kind of like one of those Russian dolls where you open it and continually pull out new layers. That's the exact experience we're going to create today. And please don't stress, this is the normal way to build applications inside of Bubble. So what we actually need to do now is make sure that for this green group, we set a type of data inside of it. And we're going to pull that data from the card group, which is the group you see the border around, which of course is inside our repeating group. So for the type of content, I'm going to set this to be, once again, a project, and I'm just going to reference the parent group's project. So that means repeating group is sending data to our card. The card is sending data to our green group. And now for this image, I'm going to insert dynamic data, and you'll see we can reference the parent group's project. Now, every time you create something inside of your database, Bubble's automatically going to store who the person was that created that item. So if we scroll all the way to the bottom, by default, you'll see an option here to reference the person who created each project. So that is the creator, which means it is a user. Now from here, what you'll notice is we can reference all of the data fields that sit under our user data type. And in this case, I just like to display their profile photo. Now, similar to how I mentioned before, when it comes to images, I personally just like to process these with Imgix, just so that way I can resize and crop the dimensions by ticking this option. I'm then going to choose to close this. If I click away, that will validate. And then we're going to scroll on down because we'll need to make this image a circle, and we'll also give it a solid border as well. So under our drop down here for our border, we're going to make this a solid. For the roundness, we're going to set this as 100, and that will make that a circle. And then if we jump over to our layout tab here, what I'm going to do is update the width of this image to be 50 pixels. And look, I am going to keep this one as a fixed value because I don't want this profile photo to expand out and take up all of this space. I only ever want it to be 50 pixels at any given point in time. I don't want it to shrink or expand based on the size of our page. It should always be this exact width. And I'd also like to tick this option while I'm here to keep this elements aspect ratio fixed. And I'm going to leave this at a 1:1 ratio, which means it's going to be a perfect square, or in this case, a perfect circle, because we've updated those borders. I'm then going to choose to vertically align this in the center of my green group, which just means that regardless of how high my green group expands, this will always be centered. And the reason I'm doing that is because I'm about to add a text element beside this, and I want these both to be perfectly aligned in the center of that group. Finally though, I would just like to add in 10 pixels of margin on the right only, so that way when I add my text element in, it doesn't directly touch my profile photo. So beside this, I'm going to head to my visual elements, grab a text element here, add this into my green group, and once again, I'm going to insert dynamic data, and in this case, I'm going to reference the parent group's project. If I scroll on down, the person who created this project, and in this case, I'm going to display their name. Now for this text, I'm going to scroll on down and detach the default style. I'm not going to update the font size, but instead I'm just going to bold this text. I'll then jump over to my layout tab here. And look, we are going to make this fully responsive. So as you probably noticed, it currently is fully responsive because the minimum width is 0 and the maximum width is infinite. So it will shrink or expand based on the size of my page. But because we have this option selected to fit the width of this element to the content inside of it, it's currently pushing it onto a new line because there's not enough space for this to be displayed. So what I'm going to do is uncheck this option, and that just means it's automatically going to fill in whatever space it can inside of our green group. I'm also then just going to vertically align this in the center of the group. So right now these are both positioned directly in the center. And that is all of the elements we actually need to add into this group. So I'm going to select on the overall group here, because when we jump into our layout tab, what we'll need to do is make sure this overall group is fully responsive. So I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0. And of course, the reason why I'm setting the minimum width to 0 here, not making it 280 like I did with my existing elements, is because I don't really need to stack any of these groups horizontally. And look, I'll do the exact same thing for the height. I'm going to set that to be 0, which is just going to close off all of the empty space between these elements here. I'll also then just give this some margin. So I'm going to add 10 pixels of margin at the top, none on the bottom, but 10 on the left and 10 on the right. And if I click away, as you'll see, those elements are being displayed below the featured image of this project. Now there is just a few last things I need to add into this overall card. And the next thing I'd like to add is just going to be a couple of text elements. And these text elements are just going to be things like the title of the project, when the campaign end date is, or how many days are until that campaign end date, as well as the overall percentage of what the fundraised amount is. So below my green group, what I'm going to do is add a text element. So if I head to my visual elements, I'll grab a text element here, and I'll just need to add this into my existing card group, making sure I don't actually add it into my green group itself. I'll then jump to my layout tab and just move this to the next position. So that way it sits below my green group. Now, I don't need to stack anything horizontally across my page inside of this group, which is why I don't need to add another group inside of my existing group. So what I'm going to do here is jump over to my Appearance tab, and I want this text to display the title of this particular project. So I'm going to insert dynamic data, and I'm going to reference the parent group's project, the title of that project. So if we just scroll down, we can reference that data field. Then from here, I'm going to scroll on down, detach the default style, and I'm going to set the font size here to be 16. I'm going to choose to bold this text, and I'd also just like to make this text expand across the full width of this particular group. So if we jump over to our layout tab, we're going to make this fully responsive, which the settings currently are, but we just need to uncheck that this element should be fixed to the width of the actual content itself. And while we're here, I'm also going to add 10 pixels of margin at the top, none on the bottom, but 10 on the left and 10 on the right. And that'll just ensure that this text element sits in line with our existing green group above it there. And finally, below this text element, I'd like to add one more, which is just going to display how many days are left on this campaign, as well as what percentage of this project has been funded. Now, if I was to jump into Kickstarter, what you might notice is that when it displays this information, you can see there's a couple of different icon elements. So there's this little clock here before the text is displayed. Now, thankfully, that is something we can easily replicate inside of Bubble, but it does just require a small minor tweak. And look, when it comes to this tweak, what we need to do is actually use a little bit of HTML. And don't worry, it's nothing complex that we can't handle. But inside of this text element, what you can do is actually format HTML, and Bubble will automatically apply that to this text inside of your app. Now, the way in which you can format that HTML is by using an open square bracket, the letters FA, a closed square bracket, and then you can just add the name of the icon in you'd like to display. So in order to get that icon name, we can head to our visual elements and just add an icon anywhere on the page. It doesn't matter, we're about to delete this. And let's search for a clock icon here. Now, what I can see is that this icon, as you'll notice, has the letters FA, similar to what we've just added. So that is the formatting, or I should say the HTML formatting of how an icon is going to be displayed inside a Bubble. And then beside this is the actual name of the icon. So this icon is called clock-o. So what you could do is highlight this, or you could just remember what it's called. Open up that text element again, and beside the closed square bracket, you could paste in the name of this icon. But when it comes to HTML code, you just need to make sure you close off the formatting. So once again, we need to add an open square bracket. Only this time, we just need to add a / just to indicate that this is in fact at the end of our HTML formatting. And once again, followed by the letters FA and then a closed square bracket. And what you'll notice is that that has now formatted that as a clock. So if you ever want to display icons inside of a text element, that is how you can do it. You can just search through your icon library and you can automatically format that. Now, the reason why you would do this is because technically you could just add an icon element onto your page and add it next to a text element. But if you're stacking elements horizontally, of course, you need to add these inside of a group. So it's just a bit more time consuming to add a group, add both of your elements inside of that group, and then configure the responsive settings of that group. Whereas when it comes to this alternative way, everything's just inside one text element. So you don't have to worry about any of that housekeeping. So what I'm going to quickly do is just delete that unnecessary icon. I'll select on my text element that I've just added. I'm going to add a space, and I'm going to now insert dynamic data, and I'm going to perform a calculation. So essentially what I want to do for this calculation is just determine what the end date is for this project. And I just want to identify how many days remain from the current date that we are on. So to do that, we're just going to reference the parent group's project, its campaign end date, and then from that end date, which is a date in the future, we're going to subtract from that the current date. So if we scroll on down, we can reference the current date time. And I'm going to format the response from this calculation as a number of days. Now, a great way to illustrate how that calculation actually works is, let's say today is the 21st of May, and my campaign end date is the 30th of May. The project's campaign end date would be the number 30, and then I'm subtracting from that the 21st, which would mean that there is 9 days left between these. And look, this is just a simple example using the same month, but this will work across any dates and time, across any time period. It could be years in the future, or just a couple of days in the future, but Bubble will automatically calculate this correctly. Then from here, what I'm going to do is select into this input field once again. I'm going to add a space and just type in some static text, which will be days left. And so if there's 3 days left, it will say 3 days left. And then beside this text, what I want to do is display the total percentage that this project has been funded. So I'm going to add another space. I'm going to add a dash followed by yet another space. And now we're going to perform a calculation. And this is where things might just get a little bit confusing. But what I want to do is calculate the percentage of how much a project has been funded based on its funding goal. So if I quickly just digress and open up my data tab, under our project data type, we had 2 fields here, and these were both numbers. So there was the funding goal. So when someone actually creates a new project, they're going to type in what amount of money they actually want to raise. So let's say it's 100K. And then every single time someone pledges an amount to this project, we're going to update and store that in this funded amount. So let's say if they've received a bunch of donations and they raised $50,000, that would be 50,000 of 100,000. So technically I want to say that this project is then 50% funded. And so the way you normally calculate a percent is that you would get the funded amount and then divide it by the funding goal, and then you would multiply that by 100. But the way in which Bubble performs calculations isn't so simple. Unfortunately, in Bubble, there's no way to actually use brackets inside of a calculation. So you can't just open up a bracket, then say, hey, I want to grab the total amount that we've raised, divide that by the funding goal, and then close off that bracket. So that way you can't get that number and then multiply that by 100. So as an alternative, there is a way around this. And it's quite simple. All you need to do is insert dynamic data. And if you type in the word arbitrary, you're going to see this option to add arbitrary text. Now, what on earth does arbitrary text mean? Look, I'm going to be honest, I didn't even know until a couple months ago. But arbitrary text just means it allows you to type in text. So it just gives you more space here. So in reality, this text here is going to be no different to the text that you can add in here. So then that raises the question, why on earth am I doing this? This arbitrary text is text on its own, broken into its own little space here. So you can kind of think of this window here as my brackets. So I can perform that first part of the calculation and then get that value as a number. And then back in my main text field here, I can multiply that by 100 and that will calculate our percent. So what we're going to do here is insert dynamic data, and we're going to reference the parent group's project, the funded amount. I'm then going to divide this number here by the parent group's project, the funding goal. And when I click away, that will validate. So that is the first part of our equation in our brackets. I'm then going to choose to close this. But one thing I should note is that as the name suggests, arbitrary text is text. Whereas right now, in order to perform a calculation, we need a number. So what I'm going to do is scroll on down and you'll see the option to convert this arbitrary text into a number. And that's exactly what we're going to do. And now you'll see the option to be able to multiply this by 100. And that is going to return the exact value that we need. The very last thing I might do though is just add a percentage symbol followed by the word funded. So if the value here is 50%, it will say 50% funded. And look, that is absolutely everything we need to build out when it comes to this dynamic value. I know it looks quite messy here, but when you run a preview of your app, it's going to format perfectly. And what we could even do is add in a canvas placeholder. Now look, when you're adding in your canvas placeholder, if you want to add these icons in, you still just need to format these in the exact same way with the HTML. So what we could even do is just make a copy of the existing HTML formatting, paste it in here, and we could say, for instance, there's 10 days left, dash, and I could say this project is 50% funded. So this is what it's going to look like. It's not actually going to take up much room at all on our page. It's automatically going to format it into the exact value we need. We will, however, just need to update the responsive settings for this. So if we jump over to our layout tab, I'm going to uncheck that this should fit the width of this element to the content inside of it. I'll add 10 pixels of margin at the top. Because this is the very last element I'd like to add into my card, I will add 10 pixels of margin at the bottom. And then I'll add 10 on the left and 10 on the right. And when I click away, you can now see that our cards have come to life. So I know it was quite a long process to get to this point, but look, we got there in the end. Now look, that is everything I want to add into this card. So now that we know what this is going to look like, we can revert back to our repeating group and make a few minor tweaks to the last settings inside of that. But perhaps before I do that, I should even click on this overall card here and open up its layout tab. So that way, just following best practice, we can set the minimum width to be 0. We can set the minimum height to be 0, just to make sure it will collapse around the vertical space of all of the elements inside of it. Now, once again, that's not going to make a huge difference visually inside of our editor, but it just ensures that we follow best practices. And from here, we can now select on our overall repeating group. So this is our repeating group project. We'll open up our layout tab and we can now set the minimum width of this to be 0. So it's just like a group. The layout settings are going to be no different. I'll set the minimum height to be 0. And because this option is selected by default to fit the height of this overall repeating group to the content inside of it, it's going to collapse perfectly around our card group that we added there. But of course, this card group has a margin of 10 pixels, so it's not going to directly touch the repeating group, which is perfect. I'm then going to select back on my repeating group because the very last thing we need to change is over in our appearance tab, and that's the actual height of the row and the cell. So anything in your layout settings when it comes to the repeating group affects the overall repeating group you see here. Whereas anything in your appearance tab, so when it comes to these dimensions, they just determine the dimensions of the cells inside of your repeating group. So that's the difference. I think that's the part that confuses most people about repeating groups, or it's definitely the thing that confused me the most in the beginning, is that I'd see some settings in my layout tab and then I'd see more in my appearance tab, and I just didn't know the difference. But it's just important to note that these settings here just affect the cell, not the overall repeating group. Now, when it comes to the minimum width and height of each cell, I'm going to be honest and say that I'm pretty happy with how the settings are. So if you remember before, I said that the values of here will just be a case of trial and error. And to start off with, I set the minimum height and the width to be 300 by 300. But look, to be honest, I'm pretty happy with these sizes here. However, I will just update the minimum width of each column to now be 320 pixels. Now, there is a very specific reason why I selected 320 pixels, and that's because, of course, if you remember in our responsive tab, the minimum width in which someone could view this whole application on when they're using a mobile device is 320 pixels. So if I set the value here as 320, it's going to be the exact same size that we need for our page. Now, I've set it at 320 because I actually don't have any margins around the repeating group. I have margins around the group that sits inside of the repeating group, but on the repeating group itself, so the repeating group project, in my layout tab, I don't have any margins. If I had 10 pixels of margin on the left and 10 pixels of margin on the right, I would need to select on the repeating group and now set this to be 300 because of course 320 minus 10 is 300. But look, for the sake of our tutorial today, I'm going to set this as 320. I'll then jump back over to my layout tab and remove these margins. And the reason I'm doing that is because when you actually go to run a preview of your application, I imagine you're going to come to your appearance tab here and you're just going to remove the solid border from this repeating group. So that way when you click away, it kind of already looks like it has a margin around it because the margin sits inside the repeating group. But look, I'm just going to revert that change because for the time being, I need to see where that repeating group is going to lie on my page. The last thing we need to update when it comes to this repeating group is just the minimum height. And look, I'm going to be honest and say you can just set this to be 0. The minimum height just determines the height of each cell, but this height will collapse and stack around all of the elements that sit inside of it. And look, we've got more than 300 pixels worth of elements that sit inside of this. So even if I set this as 0, it's just going to collapse around our group. So in most cases, I will normally set the minimum height to 0, but I'll only do that after I finish adding all of my elements inside of that repeating group. Now, if we've done everything correctly, this repeating group should be fully responsive. So this is what it looks like on a mobile device. However, as we expand the width of our page out, as you'll see, this repeating group will automatically scale beautifully across our page. So as the page increases, the cells will get larger. And then as we have enough space to display another cell, Bubble's automatically going to take care of that for us and add a third cell in. And it's going to be the same for a fourth cell. And not only will Bubble add more cells horizontally, but these can also scale down vertically. So right now you see 4 cells, but let's say there's 12 different projects you want to display on your homepage. It would display 3 rows of your repeating group. And so up to this point in time, we now have a beautifully responsive framework for our Kickstarter homepage. I know there was a lot to cover inside of this, and it's mainly because I'm just going to assume you're relatively new to Bubble, and I wanted to take the time to properly explain all of those core design concepts to you. I think it's going to make the rest of our tutorial much easier as we walk through that later on. But for the time being, what I want to do is jump back to my Notion checklist and just tick off that we finished designing the overall framework of our homepage. And of course, as I mentioned later on, we're going to focus on things like building out the navigation menu. But for the time being, this is a great place to start. Moving our way down the list of features that I have set out for us today, the next thing we're going to focus on is kind of like an extension of the homepage that we've just designed. And in this case, what we're going to do is start building out the navigation menu, which of course is going to allow users to jump between all of the different pages within our Kickstarter clone. Now look, when it comes to the navigation menu of the real-world Kickstarter product, this actually has to be one of the larger navigation menus I've ever seen across any application. So in a typical navigation menu, you would normally have a logo on the left-hand side, something like a search bar in the middle, and then some buttons and some menu options on the right-hand side. So that's completely normal. But unlike most other applications, Kickstarter also has this additional section, which is this list of categories that people can search for projects by. And so that's just something that we need to factor in. Now, if I look at this navigation menu before I even start building it inside of Bubble, what I can notice is that this is actually stacked vertically. So if this whole section at the top above this line was a big group, the way in which I would build this is set that group to be a column layout because I want to stack elements vertically. Because at the top, we've got this section here, which sits on top of all of the category options. Now, that being said, this section at the top, of course, would be another group which is scaled horizontally. So all of these elements are obviously stacked side by side. So we would add another group within our overall group and set that group's container layout to be a row. Now look, of course, I'm going to be sure to explain everything you need to know as we walk through it. But what we're going to do is jump over into our Bubble editor. Now, when it comes to building out a navigation menu, there's a couple of different ways you can do this. The easiest way would definitely be to just grab a group and add it to the top of your page here and start building it out just like this. However, when it comes to most navigation menus, you will follow a similar experience, but instead you're going to use what's known as a reusable element. Now, a reusable element, as the name would suggest, is just a feature in Bubble that allows you to build elements exactly like you would on a page. However, instead of having to rebuild that exact same element across every single page, because when you think about it, a page will always have a navigation menu. So if your app has 10 pages, you would need to design 10 navigation menus. Now for things like a navigation menu, which is always going to look the exact same across all of those 10 pages, instead of having to rebuild it from scratch each and every time, what you can do with this reusable element is build it once, and then you can simply just add that reusable element wherever you would like to reference it across any page. So that's exactly what we're going to do today. So what I'm going to do is just delete that group there. Now, in order to build this reusable element, what you need to do is open up your page drop-down menu in the top left-hand corner of your Bubble editor. And right down the bottom, you'll see an option to add a reusable element in. Now, we're going to give this a name. And today I'm just going to call mine the nav menu. I'm going to choose to create this here. It's then going to take us through to what looks like a separate page inside of Bubble. But this isn't a page, this is just what the element is going to look like. But for the time being, when you're creating this element, Bubble just takes you to a dedicated space where you can bring it to life. Now, if I was to double click on this reusable element here, what you'll notice is that this has a type of element. So by default, this element is going to be a group, which is the exact setting we want to use today. Because as I just shown you, on the homepage, if you wanted to build a navigation menu, you would just drag a group onto it and build it from there. So this is going to be a group, which is exactly what we want. There's other options, but we won't choose those right now. But while I'm here, what I'm going to do is jump over into my layout tab and first of all, update the container layout of this group. Now, as I mentioned, when it comes to the overall container layout of the navigation menu in Kickstarter, I'm under the impression that this is a column because it's stacked vertically. We've got this section here at the top, which is stacked on top of our categories. So I'm going to set the container layout to be a column. And then what you'll see is we have the options to now update the dimensions of this reusable element. And if we were to look at these dimensions, what you can see is that this reusable element by default is fully responsive. So the minimum width is set to 0, meaning it can scale down to the smallest possible size, and the maximum width is infinite, meaning it can expand to the largest possible size. So why on earth does our reusable element look like this little cube here? That's just because by default, it has this value known as the default builder width. So this is just the width that's being displayed inside of your bubble editor, or known as the builder. But please just rest assured, this is actually not the size that the element will be on your page. And I guess a good way to prove that is just by jumping over to our responsive tab. So this is what our element is going to look like on our overall page when we run a preview. And if I was to expand this out, as you can see, it is fully responsive across any device size. So while we're building this reusable element, what I personally like to do is just set the default builder width to be something like 1200, which is just going to give me enough space to make it look like it's on a desktop device. We'll also come back and update things like their minimum height in a moment, but before we do that, we need to add all of our elements inside of this. Now, the first elements I'll need to add is going to be this section at the top of my navigation menu. So we've got our Kickstarter logo, the search bar, and then a button and a menu option. Now, because all of these elements are stacked horizontally across my page, this means we need to add a group into our existing group, which is going to be set as a row container layout. So let's jump into Bubble. We're going to scroll on down to our containers menu, and we're going to grab another group and add it into my existing group. Now for this group, as I mentioned, we're going to set the container layout to be a row because we're stacking elements across our page. I'm going to jump into my appearance tab here. I'm also going to just update the background color so we can see where it actually sits inside of my navigation menu. So we're going to detach the default style here. We're going to set the background style as a flat color, and we'll make this a light shade of red for the time being, just so we can easily determine where this actually sits on my page. Now, we will come back and update all of the width and the height settings in a moment, but before we do that, what I'd like to do is add all of my elements inside of this group. And the very first element is going to be a Kickstarter logo. So I'm going to scroll on up to my visual elements. I'm going to grab an image. I'll add this into my red group. And what I'm going to do is just upload a static image, because this image is not going to change. It's always going to be the exact same image. And that's just a Kickstarter logo that I have stored on my local device here. Now, what I've done is I've also taken the time to upload the images we're going to be using today inside of this Google Drive. So you can see there is a Kickstarter logo here that you can download and use. This is the exact same image that I'm about to use. So you'll easily be able to follow along. So I'm just going to quickly jump back into my bubble editor and upload this image. And once this image is uploaded, as you can see, the image formatting isn't quite right. So we need to jump over to our layout tab and fix that. What I'm going to do is select to keep this elements aspect ratio fixed. And by default, it's going to automatically set this as the exact aspect ratio that our image was. So we don't need to change this here once we've already selected this option. What I am going to do though is just vertically align this in the center of my red group, and then give this 20 pixels of margin around every single border here. So that way it doesn't touch the borders of my overall nav menu or any other elements beside it. I'm also going to make this particular element responsive. So right now it is a fixed width and it's set at 320 pixels. Now, of course, 320 pixels is great because that is the smallest possible dimensions that someone can use on a mobile device. So once again, in our responsive tab here, as you'll see, the dimensions are 320 pixels at the smallest device. But the problem here is that we have 20 pixels of margin on each side that we've just added. So what we need to do is essentially get 320 and take 20, take another 20. But instead of making this a fixed width, what I'm actually going to do is uncheck that this should be a fixed width. And I'm going to now set the maximum width to be 320 pixels, but it's with the minimum width that I'm going to make that 280. So of course I've got the 320 and I've subtracted 40 pixels. So 20 for each side of the margins. And what you'll now see is that this logo will shrink down to the smallest possible size on a mobile. It's going to fit beautifully. But as we expand the page out, it can expand all the way up to 320 pixels. So as you'll see, when we start to increase the width of my page, it just increases in size. But I don't want it to get any larger than 320 pixels because I think that's more than enough space for this logo to take up. So that's what we're going to do for that element there. The next thing I'd like to add in is just going to be a search bar. And today for our Kickstarter clone, later on, we're going to build out our own custom search bar as well as a search experience. So what we need to do is just scroll on down to our inputs, and we're not going to use this search box here. As I mentioned, instead today we're going to create our own custom version of a search box. So we're going to use a standard input field, which will allow someone to type something in. And the first thing I'm going to do with this input field is actually not update any of the dimensions. What I'm going to do is update the name of this. So I'm going to call this input search. Now, one thing I should always point out is that when you're using an input field, it's so important to update the name of any input. And the reason for that is because when you're using inputs, you actually will eventually reference the value stored within these. So as the name suggests, input fields allow your users to input information. And so for example, if I wanted to create my own custom search experience, later on, we're going to build out a workflow. And in that workflow, we're going to send someone through to a search results page and send through the data that they type in. So if they're looking for a particular project by its title, they would type that into this input field. And I want to grab and send that information through in that workflow. And so when you're sending information in a workflow, you just need to reference which input field you're going to be grabbing the data from. So that's why it's so important to update the name of your input fields. I typically won't do it for things like images because look, I don't need to reference that data in a workflow or my database, but an input field, you definitely will. Now for this input field, I need to move this to the right of my logo. So let's jump to my layout tab, move this to the next position. And before I even update any of the layout settings here, I'm going to just jump over to my appearance tab and update the placeholder text. So the placeholder text is just the text you see inside of this field, which is just placed there until a user actually starts typing. So it kind of just prompts someone to use the input field. And I'm just going to have this say the words search projects ... Then from here, we can jump over to our layout tab. And when it comes to the dimensions of this input field, right now it is not responsive. It is a fixed width of 250 pixels, which means that it's always going to be this exact size you see here. And that's not the experience we want to create. I want this to be fully responsive. So what I'm going to do is uncheck that this should be a fixed width. And similar to our logo here, what I'm going to do is set the minimum width to be 280 pixels. But when it comes to the maximum width, I am going to leave this as infinite. Because when you look at the real world Kickstarter project, as you can see, the search box actually takes up quite a bit of space at the top of the nav menu. So I am going to allow this to take up as much space as it needs. While we're here though, I'm going to leave the height fixed at 48 pixels because I don't want this input field to expand down. I only ever want it to be this exact height. So I'm quite happy with the default setting. I'll also just add 10 pixels of margin around every single border, not 20 in this case. And the reason for that is just because as you see, our input field is actually larger than our logo. So we don't need as much space before it touches the borders of my red group. I'm also going to make sure this is vertically aligned in the center of our red group, so that way it's perfectly in line with my logo. And that's all we need to change for this input field. Beside this though, I just want to add in the very last elements on the right-hand side, and that's just going to be a button as well as a text element. Now I can kind of see that these two elements here are grouped on their own on the right-hand side. So the way I look at this is that this would have another group around it, and that group would be stacking these two elements horizontally, so in a row container layout. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to add another group into our existing group, and we're going to stack these two elements together. So let's jump over into our bubble editor. I'm going to scroll on down to my containers menu. I'll grab a group. I'll add this group inside of my existing red group. And look, for this group, the first thing I'm going to do is just update the background color so I can easily see where it sits on my page. So I'm going to detach the default style, I'll set it as a flat color, and I'm going to make this a light shade of, let's say, blue. That's perfect. I'll jump over to my layout tab, and I want to move this group to the far right-hand side. So I'm going to make this the last element inside of my red group. And now what I'm going to do before I make any changes to the layout settings of this group is add my two elements inside of it. So as you could see before, there was a button element as well as a text element. So we're going to scroll on up to our visual elements, grab a button here, add this into my blue group, and I'm going to have this button display the words start a project. And I can just see I'm missing a letter here. I'll add that in. Now, when it comes to this group, what I'm going to do is make it the same kind of style here. So it's going to be a white group with a black border around it. But instead of just attaching the style, what I'm going to do is make my own custom style. Now, this is the first time I'm doing this within this tutorial today. And the reason for this is because when it comes to things like buttons, I want all of my buttons to look the same consistent way wherever I use them inside of my app. So instead of having to detach the style and edit that every single time, what I'm going to do is create a design style. So it's kind of like a reusable element in a way where I can just design it once and then I can reference that style whenever I would like. Now, if I was to open up the style menu, you can see that by default, Bubble gives you a couple of different options here. So there's the primary button and then there's the outline button. Now, throughout our tutorial today, later on, I am going to update the primary button style. I'm going to make it the same green color as the Kickstarter logo. But for this button, I want it to be like the outline button because as you can see, this button is clear and it's just got a solid border, which is the outline of it. But if I was to click away, as you can see, that outline is currently blue, whereas I want to make that a shade of black. So in order to update this style, I'm not going to make a one-off change here. Instead, I'm actually going to edit the overall style. And it's going to take us through to our Styles tab. And any changes I make here are automatically going to apply to anywhere else that I use this button. That is the benefit of Styles. You can design it once and you can reference it anywhere else. Now, when it comes to this button, the changes I'm going to make is first of all the font color. I'm going to make this a shade of black, which if you'd like this color code, it's 484848. I'm then going to scroll on down and I'm going to do the exact same thing for the border color. I'm going to make that the same color code. So once again, 484848. And while we're here, what I'm also going to do is just remove the roundness of its borders. So I'm going to set this to be 0, just so that way it has some sharp edges. And then finally, if I head over to my conditional tab here, I can see there is a condition added by default, which if I turn this on here, this just says that when this button is hovered, so when someone puts their mouse over the top of it, it's going to change the background color to this color here. Now that's not the experience I want to create, so I'm just going to remove that condition. And look, that is everything I need to change when it comes to this button. And as you'll see when I click away, that has been updated. Now, if I was to add a button somewhere else inside of my app and just set this to be the outline button style, as you can see, it is now the exact same style that we just created. So once again, with styles, you create it once and you can reference it as many times as you would like. Now, when it comes to this button, I am just going to jump to my layout tab and update the dimensions of this. So by default, it is a fixed width at 150 pixels. Now I'm quite fine with that. So this button will never be any larger and any smaller. And look, that's completely fine with me. I only need it to be the size of a normal button, which I think this is quite normal. However, with the height, I think it's quite narrow there. So I might just quickly set the minimum height here to be 50. And look, if I really wanted, I could make this a fixed height, which just means that it will always be 50 pixels. And that is all I will need to change to these dimensions here. Now, another thing I'd like to do, as I said before, is just add in a text element beside this button. However, if I click on the group here, I can see that I haven't actually set this to be a container layout of a row. It's currently still a column. So I need two elements to be stacked horizontally, so directly side by side. So if I set this as a row, that will allow me to do that. Now, another thing I should point out is that if I click back on my button, after it sits inside of a group that is a row container layout, you'll now see the option to vertically align this in the center of that group. So that's what I'm going to do. That will just make sure that whatever elements I add in are going to be perfectly in line. So let's go ahead and add that text element in now. So under our visual elements, I'm going to grab a text element here. I'll add this in, and this is just going to display the words log in. Now, when it comes to this text, what I'm going to do is scroll on down and just attach the default style. I'm just going to create a one-off font size here. So I'm going to set the font size to be 20. I'll then jump over to my layout tab. And look, when it comes to the dimensions of this text, I'm quite happy with all the settings that it has. So I'm going to leave it fully responsive as it is. This is even one of the rare occasions where I'm going to keep this option selected to fit the width of this element to the content inside of it. Because I don't actually want this text element to take up as much width as it can on my page. I only want to allocate this amount of space to it. It's not that important. The only other thing I'd like to change in my layout tab is, of course, I'd like to vertically align this text in the center And then I'm just going to add 20 pixels of margin to the left side. So that way it is spaced away from my button. Now that is both of the elements, or I should say all of the elements that I want to add into my blue group. So I'm going to select on my blue group, and now I can update all of the layout settings here. And so when it comes to this group, I'm going to first of all set the minimum width of this to be 0. And then I'm going to tick this option to fit the width of this element to the content inside of it. And that's just going to remove any empty space that we had there on the right hand side. And then for the minimum height, I can also set this to be 0, and that will just collapse nicely around all of my elements there. Then for this overall blue group, I would like to vertically align this in the center of my red group, so it sits in line with all of my existing elements. And then finally, I'm going to add 20 pixels of margin around every single border here, so that way it doesn't touch the borders of my overall page. Now, another thing I'd like to do is just select on my red group. So I finished adding all of my elements into this group, which means I now need to just update all of the layout settings for that red group itself. So similar to before, we're now going to set the minimum width to be 0, which of course is just going to make sure this is fully responsive, so it can shrink down to the smallest possible size, as well as expand to the largest possible size. I'll set the minimum height to be 0, which is just going to collapse around the height of all of our elements. That's perfect. But something else I'm going to do is update the container alignment here. So if I was to jump over to my responsive tab and expand this out, I just want to make sure that all of my elements are spaced evenly out from each other, which it looks like they already are. But what I'm going to do is select this space between option, which is just going to make sure that there's an even amount of space between all of my elements here. So this is going to make sure they're not all just pushed to the left-hand side, but regardless of whatever size a user's browser is, these should evenly be spaced apart. Now look, it's not going to make too much of a visual difference here, but look, it's just going to help us follow best practice. And look, as you can see, our navigation menu is coming together quite nicely here. What we could even do while we're here is just build out our very first workflow, which will send a user through to the home page whenever they click on our Kickstarter logo. So let's go ahead and quickly do that. What we're going to do is double click on our image element, head to our appearance tab, and we're going to choose to add a workflow whenever someone clicks on this image. Now within this workflow, it's super straightforward. As I said, I just want to help someone navigate through to our home page. So if we head to our navigation events, we're going to choose the go to page action. So we're going to send someone through to a page, and the destination page they'll need to go to is going to be the index page, which if you remember, the index page was our home page, which is where we've just designed the actual Kickstarter clone. Now within this workflow, we don't need to send any data. We'll touch base on that later on, but this is going to be super straightforward. Now something I personally like to do is I like to color code my workflows inside a bubble. So if I click on the workflow trigger, I can choose to update the event color here. Now I personally set any navigation events to be in red. So that way when I come back to my workflow tab here, later on this is going to have lots of different workflows. And I'll know that any red workflow is related to sending someone through to a page. So it just helps me keep things in order. That's all we need to do for this though. As I said, it was super straightforward. But now what we can do is design the very last section of our overall navigation menu, which is the list of categories that you see here. Now, if you remember, this list has already been created in our database. So under our data tab, we created a list of option sets, which was known as the category. So this is where we displayed all of the categories. So I essentially just want to display a list of all of these elements horizontally across my page here. Now, of course, as I've mentioned in our previous module, when you need to display a list of anything inside a bubble, you'll need to use a repeating group element. So if we scroll on down to our containers menu, we're going to grab a repeating group and add this below our red group. And look, by default, it might just add it to the top. So I could jump to my layout tab and move this to the next position. And what you might notice is that by default, a repeating group actually scales vertically down our page, not horizontally across it. So this is going to take a few minor tweaks to get exactly what we want. So when it comes to this repeating group, let's jump over to our appearance tab. Because as I'd mentioned in our previous module, whenever you're working with a repeating group, the very first thing you'll need to do is give this a data source, because it needs to know from your database which content is it going to display. So which list of items will it show? And in this case, we're going to set the type of content to be our option set category. So that's our list of categories that I just shown you. Then for the data source, I'm just going to simply reference all of the categories within our option set list. It's truly as simple as that. We don't need to perform a search for any dynamic data. It's just going to pull that list from our option set. Now, if we move on down to the number of rows and columns we need here, we actually need to uncheck both of these options. Now, why are we doing that? What you'll notice is that when you uncheck both of these options, you now have this additional menu here, which allows you to select the scroll direction of this repeating group. And you'll see there's vertical, but what we're interested in today is the horizontal option. So the horizontal option is going to allow us to create this experience where you see this list scaled across the width of your page. So from here, we can jump back into our bubble editor. And similar to what I'd previously mentioned when it comes to working with a repeating group, what I'll typically do is just add in some test values into these fields here. So to determine the height of each row and the width of each column, I don't really know what that's going to be at this point in time because I haven't added any content into my rows. And I can see these are actually quite high, but quite narrow. So what I might do is just set, for instance, the minimum height to be 200 and the minimum width to be 200. And look, these values are not exact. I'm sure we're going to come back later on and update these, but this is just going to give me enough space to add the elements that I need inside of my repeating group. And then finding the right dimensions is just going to be a matter of coming back later on and adjusting those based on trial and error. Before I add my elements into this repeating group though, I'd also just like to jump over to my layout tab. Now for this repeating group, we're actually going to add only one element inside of each cell. So it's just going to be one text element that you see there. So it doesn't really matter if you set the container layout to be a column or a row, because we're actually not stacking elements on top of each other. There's only going to be one element. But look, personally, I'm a row guy myself, so I just like to choose the row option. And then from here, what we're going to do is grab our text element and add this into our very first repeating group cell. Now, for this text element, what I'm going to do is insert dynamic data because I'd like to display each of the relevant category names. So I'm going to reference the current cell's category, and that's going to link to our option set. So I'm just going to quickly digress here. So it's going to grab from our option set list all of the categories. And if you remember, with the option set, by default, we've given these all a name, which is known as the display text. So the word art is the display text for this option. And the reason I say that is because right now you'll see the option to reference the current cell's category, it's display, which is just the name of that category. Then what I'm going to do for this text is just scroll on down, detach the default style. I'm going to leave the font size as is, but I'd like to align all of that text in the center and also choose to bold this text. I'm then going to jump to my layout tab here. I will vertically align this text in the center of my repeating group. I'm going to also leave all of my width and height settings as they are. So right now these are fully responsive, and I do want to keep the width of this element to the content inside of it. And the reason I'm doing that is because I want each repeating group cell to snap around the actual word itself. So as you can see, the word art is much smaller than the word journalism. So I only want each cell to take up the space that it needs for each individual word. So I'm fine with this option here. What I will just do is add 10 pixels of margin around every single border here. So that way the text doesn't touch the border of my repeating group cell. And that's actually all we need to add into this repeating group. This one is super simple. We will just need to close off all of this empty space that you see now. So to do that, we're going to select on the overall repeating group. So you can click anywhere but the first cell. We'll jump into our layout tab, and we can now first of all set the minimum width of this to be 0, which means it's going to be fully responsive. So we can either shrink down to the smallest possible size or take up all of the width of our page. And look, for the maximum width of this repeating group, I don't actually want it to take up the full width of my page. Because if we were to look at the real world Kickstarter app here, this repeating group doesn't scale right to the width of each sides of the page here. It kind of cuts off at a certain width. So what I'm going to do is give this a maximum width of, let's say, 750 pixels. Now look, there's no scientific reason why I selected 750. I'm just going to play around and see if that's enough width to display all of my categories. I am then just going to quickly scroll on down to my minimum height and set that to be 0, which means it's going to collapse around my elements inside of it. When it comes to my margins, I'm then going to add 20 pixels of margin at the top, 20 on the bottom, 50 on the left, and 50 on the right. Now, at this point in time, I've actually cut off all of my text, but I assure you there is a method to this madness. The reason why you can't see my text is because over in our appearance tab, we still have these settings here, which are going to determine the height and the width of each row. So we will need to come back and update those. But before I do that, there's just one last setting that I want to change here. And that is that I just want this repeating group to be in the center of my nav menu. So under the horizontal alignment, I'm going to put this in the center, and that'll just make sure it's neat and tidy. And now we can jump over to our appearance tab and do damage control on these values. So as I've mentioned in the past, finding the perfect values for these options is just a matter of tweaking around with them. So when it comes to these values here, what I'm going to do is actually set the minimum width of each column to be 0. And what that means is it's going to be responsive based on the size of the text inside of each cell. So this is where horizontal repeating groups are different from vertical repeating groups. And look, in my opinion, horizontal repeating groups are much harder to configure than vertical repeating groups. And thankfully, I'm pretty sure this is the only horizontal repeating group in our whole tutorial today. I've been using Bubble for years at this point, and look, horizontal repeating groups still kind of scare me. But look, we're still out here trying. So when it comes to the width, we're going to set that to be 0. Then when it comes to the minimum height, so right now it's got 200 pixels in height, which is quite large. I'm going to try and set the minimum height to be 100. So I'm just going to minimize that a little bit, and I can now see my text element. But right now, this doesn't look pretty. My text is sitting at the bottom of the actual element itself. And I think I have a hunch as to what might be causing that to look exactly like this. If I was to quickly just jump back to my layout tab, when it comes to the height of my overall repeating group, right now I've set that the minimum height should be 0 pixels and the maximum height should be infinite. So when it comes to the height here, it can be as large as it possibly wants. So I think that's what it's doing. It's recognized that it's got all of this space, so the white space that you see here inside of my reusable element. So it's trying to take up all of that space, which then means that my text element is sitting down lower because it's also fitting into that space. So what I'm going to do is actually make this element a fixed height. And I'm going to make this something like, let's say 100 pixels, which I can see is a lot. We don't need this much space. So let's try and make it 80 pixels, not 800. Still too much. What about 50? There's still a lot. Maybe 40 could work. And so this is kind of like a trial and error to find the right size here. But what I've noticed is that my text, for some reason, has just been cut off. So if I go back to 50, what I might actually do is select on my text. And right now I've vertically aligned this in the center of my repeating group. So if I move this to the top, it's actually going to look a lot better there. And so what I can see is I still just have a little bit too much space. So between my text and the margins at the top and the bottom, there's still just this little caveat of empty space. So perhaps I could select on that repeating group and try and fit the fixed height here to be 40 pixels. And honestly, that looks pretty good to me. And after editing that, what I can do is select on my repeating group, jump over to my appearance tab, and right now I know the minimum height of my row, and that should be 40 pixels. So it's not going to actually visually change anything, but it's going to be the exact same height as our overall repeating group. Now look, that was an absolute mission to get these values, and trust me, I know it. But as I said, horizontal repeating groups are much more difficult to configure than vertical repeating groups. So please don't stress, particularly if you are brand new to Bubble. Everything I probably just said made no sense at all. And that's because, as I've said before, horizontal repeating groups truly are a matter of trial and error. I've never got one perfect from the get-go. And I typically find that in order to find the perfect dimensions, you kind of have to run a preview of your app to see what it's going to look like. But look, I'm pretty confident with what we've just built for today. The very last thing we just need to do though within our navigation menu is close off all of this empty space at the bottom here. So I'm going to double click on our overall navigation menu. So this is our nav menu here. I'm going to jump to my layout tab and I can see there is a minimum height of 200 pixels. I'm just going to set that to be 0. And of course that will then collapse around all of the empty space here. Now thankfully that is everything we need to build out. The only thing left to do is of course add this navigation menu to our home page. So let's open up our page drop down menu. And look, I should just point out that later on, we are going to come back and build out all of the workflows that power things like our search experience, our login experience, as well as our categories here. But for the time being, I just wanted to build the overall structure of this menu. But let's jump to our index page and add this navigation menu to the top of our page here. And this is where you're going to see the benefit of reusable elements come to life. So if I just scroll all the way down to the bottom of my elements tree and move my head out of the way there, you'll see the option to add a reusable element onto your page. And surprise, surprise, we have our navigation menu here. So I'm going to select this and add it to the top of my page. And as you will see, it's going to automatically add everything onto it. And this is the beautiful thing about reusable elements. You only have to design it once, and now you can easily just add this onto every single page. And because we've built out our workflow inside of this reusable element, that same workflow is going to run on every other page that we add this menu to. One thing I should point out though is that you can't make changes to this reusable element directly on this page. So as you'll see, when I hover over this, I can't actually jump in and move any elements around. If you ever want to make changes, you need to go back to the actual reusable element itself and make those changes here. But for the time being, what I want to do is quickly just run a preview of this page here, just so you can get an idea of what it's going to look like. And right now, we don't really have any data inside of our database to display any projects, but this is what our overall Kickstarter clone is starting to look like. So we've got our navigation menu here, and of course that includes both of our sections. It's got our list of categories, which is displayed horizontally across our page, and then we've got all of the existing elements that we added onto our homepage before. One thing I might just do though is add in a line to separate my navigation menu from the overall page, just like the real world Kickstarter product has here. So as you can see, there's kind of like a border around this reusable element. So if I quickly just jump back to my bubble editor, I'm going to open up my reusable element. I'll double click on the white part of my group, which is the overall element. And if I head to my appearance tab, I can just choose to add a solid border around this. And then if I quickly just jump back to my preview, refresh the page, what you'll notice is that that border has automatically been applied there. And that's perfect. From here though, let's jump back into our Notion checklist and tick off that we've finished building out the crux of our navigation menu, which included both the top section, the list of categories, and I've just shown you how we could also add that reusable element onto any page inside of our app. Scrolling down through our list of features here, I hope you're ready because we've got quite a bit in store for this module as well as the following module. In this section, what we're going to do is just cover how we can now create a Kickstarter project within our overall build today. Now look, there is quite a bit involved within this, so I've broken this down into a couple of separate modules. In this first module, what we're going to do is actually build the design of the page that's going to power this feature. And then in the next module, we're going to create all of the workflows and also make a few finishing touches to that page. But before we jump into anything, what I'd like to do is just show you a quick preview of what this is going to look like. So if I was to jump over to a separate browser that I have here, this is a preview of an existing Kickstarter clone that I've created. And when someone chooses to start or create a new project, this is what the experience is going to look like. So they're going to come to this page here where they can add in all of the overarching details about this project. So things like the title, the category, the thumbnail image, the video, the launch date, and so on. Then once they've added that information in, they can select this next button, and then they can add the full description of their project. So they've got a rich text editor here, so they can make changes to the styling of that text. They can add things like images and so on. Once they do that, they can then select next again. And this is where they can add all the details about the rewards and the different tiers that people can back inside of this project. So they can add their funding goal. And then if they want to choose to add rewards, they can select this button. And look, everything is color coded here just because I was building this inside of Bubble. So I color coded all of my groups. However, when they choose to add a reward, they can add in all of the details for this. They can choose to save that, and then it will display that reward in a repeating group below this, before they can then select save on this entire project, and it will create that entry in our database. And of course, it's then eligible to be displayed in our platform. And so although this experience looks quite intuitive, there is a lot happening behind the scenes here. So every single line you see here is a different group. So this is a group within a group that sits on my page. And if I refresh this page and go back to the start of this experience, these are breaking down all separate groups. So every time I hit next, it hides one group and displays the next group. So there's a lot that we actually need to build out today, which is why I've broken this down into 2 separate modules. So within the first module, we're going to design all of these individual groups, and we'll power the experience that allows us to click between them. And then in the next module, as I mentioned before, we can build out the workflow that actually creates a project inside of our database. So let's jump over into our main browser and open up our Bubble editor. So this is my original Kickstarter clone. And what we're going to do first of all is create a brand new page inside of our app. So we're going to open up our page drop-down menu. We're going to choose to add a new page, and we're going to call this the create page because this is where someone is going to create a project. And like always, when it comes to creating a new page, the very first thing we need to do is set a container layout on this. So we're going to double click on the overall page itself, jump to my layout tab, and of course set the container layout to be a column because on this page, I want to stack elements from top to bottom, so vertically down my page. Then from here, what I would typically do on a page is add in my reusable navigation menu. However, on this page, I don't actually want to add that in because when someone comes to the process of creating a project, I want their focus to be specifically on this page. I don't want them to be able to navigate anywhere else because I want to incentivize them to create a project, similar to how the real-world Kickstarter product functions. And so as you saw before, all I had at the top of the page was just a Kickstarter logo. So what we're going to do is add an image element to the very top of my page. So let's head to our visual elements, grab an image, and add it onto our page. And for the image we're going to use, it's just going to be the Kickstarter logo that we used in our navigation menu. So I'm just going to upload that from my device here. And of course, once this image is uploaded, we definitely need to change the formatting of this because this is quite obscured. So let's jump to our layout tab. And the first thing I'm going to do is tick this option to keep this element's aspect ratio fixed. And it's going to default to the actual aspect ratio of the image. So it's going to fit perfectly on my page. I'm also then going to horizontally align this in the center of my page. I'll add in 20 pixels of margin at the top, none on the bottom, but 20 on the left and 20 on the right. And now I'd also like to make this image fully responsive because if I was to open up my responsive tab here and reduce the width of my browser, as you'll see, it looks great until I go to the smallest possible size on a mobile device, which is 320 pixels. And as you can see with these margins, it's actually getting cut off. So the full image isn't being displayed inclusive of the margins. So what we need to do is adjust the width of this. Currently, it is a fixed width of 320 pixels. So technically the whole logo would fit on my page, but it's sitting on the borders of my page, which I don't really think that's a nice experience. So what I'm going to do is unselect that there should be a fixed width. Now I'm going to set the maximum width to be 320 pixels. So at the largest possible size, this image will never increase beyond what you see here. But for the minimum width, instead of it being 320 pixels, I'm going to take this number and subtract 20 pixels for each side of margin that I have. So 320 minus 20 minus another 20 is going to be 280. And as you'll now see, this will fit perfectly inside of my page on the smallest possible device size. And as my page expands, it will also expand that image out. So that's how we can make that image fully responsive. Now below this is where the fun's going to start. This is where we can start to add all of our different groups that are going to create this experience. And look, before we do this, what I want to do is just give myself more room to work with on this page for the time being. So I'm going to double click on the page once again. I'm going to head to my layout tab, and for the minimum height, I'm going to make this something insane. So I'm going to make it like 2500 pixels. And look, that is just more than enough space to work within. But because I'm adding so many different groups onto my page, I'd rather be safe than sorry. And look, when you go to publish your app, you can come back and update this height. But for the time being, I just want to give us more room than we need. And now from here, we can add in the very first group, which is going to contain the first section of our process to create a new Kickstarter project. So let's scroll on down to our containers menu and grab a group element. We'll add this onto our page. And the very first thing I want to do is actually update the naming convention of this group. I'm going to call this group step 1. And this is important because later on, when I choose to hide and display different groups, I need to know specifically which group I want to hide and which group I want to show. And so that's why it's important to give these groups a name. I'm then going to jump to my appearance tab, and I'm just going to detach the default style of this group because I'd like to scroll on down and give this a solid border. And the reason I'm doing that is because when I click away, I want to be able to see where this group sits on my page. I'll then select on the group again, and set the roundness of its borders to be 10, so that way it also has some curved edges. And if I jump over to my layout tab, we're just going to need to make sure that the container layout is set as a column, which it is by default. That's great. And look, we're going to come back later on and update the height, the width, and all the margins. But before we do that, I want to add all of my elements into this group. And the very first element is just going to be a static text element that looks like a heading. So let's scroll on up to our visual elements, grab a text element and add it in here. And this is just going to display the words start with basics. And when it comes to this text, I'm going to scroll on down, detach the default style and set the font size to be 30 pixels. I will then also align this text in the center here before I then jump over to my layout tab and make this fully responsive. So I want this to span across the full width of my page or the full width inside of this group here. So right now it is fully responsive because the minimum width is 0 and the maximum width is infinite. So technically this text element will shrink down to the smallest possible size, but it can also expand out to the largest possible size. So that's great. But by default, we have this option selected to fit the width of this entire element to the content inside of it. So that's why it's collapsing around this text. So what I'm going to do is uncheck that option, and as you'll see, it's going to span across the full width of my page and it will automatically center that inside of the element. Then while we're in our layout tab, I'm going to add 30 pixels of margin at the top, 20 on the left and 20 on the right here, before I then make a copy of this text element, because what I want to do is just add a subheading into this group. And when it comes to this text, I'm just going to have this display the words, make it easy for people to learn about your project. And I can see I just need to fix a small typo there. And look, for this text, I don't want this to be as large as my main heading. So what I'm going to do is scroll on down and set the font size to be 20. I'm also just going to close off some of this gap here. So I'm going to jump to my layout tab and reduce the top margin from 30 to 20 pixels. And because we copied this text element across, it's also copied across all of the margins around it. So we don't need to change anything there. Now below this, we're going to start to add in our series of input fields, which is going to allow users to add in the basic overview details about their project they're creating. And above each input field, I'd like to add in a text element that displays what someone should add into that field. So I'm going to make yet another copy of this text element. Only this time, I'm going to jump to my appearance tab and update the text here to display the word title. I'm also going to position this text to the left-hand side of this group. So if I just move my property editor up, I'm going to align this to the left. I'll keep the font size as is, but I'd also just like to increase the margin now to kind of push this text away from the subheading there. So back in my layout tab, I'm actually going to set the top margin of this text to be 30. And then below this, we can add in our very first input field. So if we scroll on down to our input forms, I'm just going to grab a standard input and I'll add this into my group. And when it comes to input fields, the first thing you need to do, of course, is give this a name, because in a moment, when we build out the workflow that's going to power this whole experience and create a new project inside of our database, we need to know which input fields we're storing which specific data inside of. So that's why it's so important to always update the conventions of your inputs. And so this one here is just going to be called input title. Then I'm going to jump to my layout tab and I'm going to move this to the next position in my group. So that way it sits below its relevant heading. And then I'm going to make this fully responsive. So right now this is currently a fixed width of 250 pixels, which means it's going to be no larger or smaller than this exact width you see here. And that is not the experience we want. We want this to span a bit further out across my page. So what I'm going to do is unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0. So that way this input can shrink down to the smallest possible size. However, with the maximum width, I don't want it to take up the entire width of my page. I just personally think that's a bit unnecessary. So I'm going to give this a maximum width of, let's say, 800 pixels. Now, there's no specific reason why I selected 800. That's just my personal preference. If you want this to be 600, 400, 300, that is completely up to you. But I'm going to set mine as 800. So that way, at the largest possible size, it will be no wider than what you see here. Then for the height, I'm just going to leave this fixed at 48 pixels. I don't really need this input field to expand down any further, so I'm going to keep it as is. But for the margins, I'll add 20 pixels of margin on the left and 20 on the right, so that way it doesn't touch the borders of my group. Then below this, we're going to make a copy of this input field and my title. So I'm going to select on both of these elements, make a copy, and I'll just need to move the position of these. So to do that, just jump to your layout tab, and you can move these to the previous, the next, or the last position. But before I update any of the input fields, I just want to update the title here, or I should say my text. And so I just like this to display the word subtitle. So this is where someone can add just a little bit of additional information into the name of this project. And what I will also need to do is select on my input field and update the naming convention of this. So instead of being called input title, I'm going to call this input subtitle. And that's all we need to change because we copied this across. Of course, it has the same width and margins as our previous element. Then below this, we're going to make a copy of our text element, and we're going to have this display the word category because, as you guessed, I'd like to allow someone to select which category this specific project belongs to. Now, for the input field that we're going to use for the category, we're going to use a drop-down field. So I'm going to add this into my group. And of course, the first thing I'll do for this drop-down is update the name of this. I'm going to call this drop-down category. Now, when it comes to a drop-down input field, the name's kind of self-explanatory. What happens with this is a user selects from the drop-down and it opens up a list of options that they can select from. Now, that list of options can be determined by something that you just type into this field here, or if you already have those options stored in your database, you can easily reference them. And thankfully, if you remember, when we set up our database, we do have those options already created as a list of option sets. So if I quickly just digress and open up my data tab, under our option sets here, we had the category option set. So essentially when someone clicks on this dropdown, I want all of these options to be displayed, and that is super simple to do with this dropdown. So all we need to do is update the choices style, and we're going to change this from a list of static choices that we type in, and we're going to pull a list of dynamic choices. And there's that word dynamic again. Dynamic means we're going to pull data that exists from our database. So I'm going to select that this should be a list of dynamic choices. For the type of choices, I'm going to reference my category option sets. And then for the choices source, I'm going to display all of the categories. And then finally for the caption, which is the text that displays for each option, this will just be the display text of each option set. So that's all we need to change there. I will then jump over to my layout tab and move this to the next position. And when it comes to the width settings of this dropdown, I would just like to increase the width just a tiny bit. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width as 0 to make it fully responsive. But for the maximum width, I'm going to make this half the width of my input fields above it there, because we don't need so much width for this dropdown. So I'm going to set the maximum width here to be 400 pixels, which is exactly half. I'm then going to add 20 pixels of margin on the left and the right. And look, we don't need to change any of the height settings. This is perfect as is. And below this, we're going to make yet another copy of my text element. I'll jump to my appearance tab, and this is going to display the word thumbnail image. So this is where someone can obviously upload the thumbnail image that's going to display on our homepage or our search results page for each project. So in order to allow them to upload an image, we're going to scroll on down to our input forms. I'm just going to move my head out of the way, and then I'm going to grab a picture uploader. I'll add this into my group, and this is going to be called the picture uploader thumbnail image. And for this particular input, we'll jump to our layout tab, move it to the next position, and I'm also going to make it 400 pixels in width. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width, set the minimum width to 0, and the maximum width to 400 pixels. But what I'm also going to do is set the height here to be 200 pixels. So 200 is half of 4, which means that the aspect ratio is now going to be 2:1. So it's going to be a perfect rectangle. I'll then also just add 20 pixels of margin on the left, 20 on the right. And then as you've guessed, we're going to make yet another copy of our text element here. And this is going to display the words launch video. So this is where someone can upload a video that can be displayed on the campaigns page later on in our build. Now, when it comes to uploading a video, this is going to be uploaded as a file. So if we head to our input forms, once again, I'm going to need to move my head out of the way. You'll see there's an input here known as the file uploader. This is going to be exactly what we want. Of course, because this is an input, we'll need to update the name of this. So I'm going to call this file uploader launch video. And once again, I'm going to jump to my layout tab and update the dimensions of this. So I will unselect that this should be a fixed width. If we want to make this fully responsive, the minimum width should be 0. And the maximum width will once again be 400 pixels. So that way it's the exact same width as our picture uploader. However, when it comes to the height here, instead of this being fixed at 48 pixels, what I'm going to do is actually set this to be 100 pixels, and I will keep this value fixed. So it's just going to make it a less narrow rectangle. And perhaps I should also explain how a file uploader works. If someone was to upload a video, it's not going to automatically play that video here. It's just going to display the name of the file. So you don't really need this to be very big because it's just going to display some text inside of it. So that's why we can keep the height fixed at 100 pixels. I will just add 20 pixels of margin on the left and the right and move it to the next position. And look, at this point in time, there is still just 2 last input fields I need to add. That is just going to be the target launch date for this campaign, as well as the end date for the fundraising. So we're going to make another copy of the text here, and I will head to my appearance tab and have this display target launch date. So this is the date that the final product will be released to all of the backers. And if we head to our input forms, there is an input known as the date time picker. I'm going to add this in, and I'm just going to quickly update the name of this. This will be called date time picker launch date. And I'll just need to move this to the bottom of my group. So if I jump to my layout tab, I'll move this to the next position, and I'll just keep moving it to the bottom of my group. And before I update any additional layout settings here, what I'd like to do is jump to my appearance tab and just update the way in which this date is formatted. And so instead of just displaying these numeric values, I'm going to select this option, which displays the day written out, the month, the date, and then the year here. Now look, this isn't completely necessary, but this is just a personal preference of mine. I think it's just easier to interpret. I'll then jump over to my layout tab and make this fully responsive. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. As you probably guessed, we're going to set the minimum width to 0, and I'm going to leave the maximum width as 400 pixels again. So that way it's perfectly in line with all of my additional elements that sit above it there. When it comes to the height, we can also leave this fixed at 48 pixels. I don't need this to expand any higher. And of course, we'll add 20 pixels of margin on the left and the right hand side. And of course, there is just one last input field we need to add on to our page, and that is going to be another date time picker, which allows us to determine when this campaign will end its fundraising. So we're going to make one last copy of this text element, and I'm just going to jump to my appearance tab and have this display the words campaign end date. And look, for this input field, we're going to use another date time picker, but I'm just going to make a copy of my existing date time picker here. But of course, I'll just need to update the name of this. So instead of calling this the date time picker launch date, this will be the campaign end date. And for this date time picker, I do just want to make a minor tweak here. So instead of allowing someone to just select a date, I want them to be able to choose a date and a time. And as you'll now see, this will divide this input field into 2 separate sections. So this will allow someone to actually just select an actual hour on a particular date that this campaign will finish. So it might be 2 p.m. in the afternoon, or it might be 11 p.m. at night. But unlike the launch date, the time kind of does matter when it comes to the campaign cutoff date. And for the time structure here, I'm going to make this in 12-hour time, not 24-hour time, because that's also just my personal preference. But look, thankfully, because we copied this input field across, we don't need to update any of the responsive settings or the margins. They've also been copied across as well. So this is everything I wanted to add into my first group in terms of input fields. So what we now need to do is add a little save button, or a next button, I should say, in the bottom right-hand corner of this group, which when clicked will hide this group and display our second group. So what we're going to do is scroll on up to our visual elements, grab a button, we'll add this into our group, and this button will just display the word next. I'll then jump to my layout tab and move this to the last position in my group. But I want this button to be positioned on the right-hand side of my page, not the left-hand side. So for the horizontal alignment, I'm going to position this to the right. And then the last thing we'll need to do is just give this some margins. I'm quite happy with the width and the height, but I'd like to add 30 pixels of margin at the top, 30 on the bottom, 20 on the left, and 20 on the right. And that is everything I need to add into our very first group. So what I'm now going to do is select on the overall group itself. So this is group step 1. I'm going to open up my layout tab here, and then I'm going to update the responsive settings for this specific group. So to make this fully responsive, I'm going to set the minimum width as 0. I'll also now set the minimum height to be 0, and that's just going to ensure that the height will collapse around all of the elements inside of it. And then finally, I'm also going to add 20 pixels of margin around every single border, so that way this group doesn't touch the borders of my page. And as you can see, that has come together quite nicely. Now from here, we can start to build out the second group, and look, thankfully that one's going to be a much faster process, Because what we can actually do is make a copy of our first group here. So that way we don't have to build that group from scratch. So what I'm going to do is select on my first group, make a copy of this, scroll all the way down, and I can see my copied version. And the first thing we'll do is update the naming convention. I'm going to call this group step 2. And all we now need to do is just change the text and the headings as well as which input fields we'd like to add in. So for the main heading, I'm going to have this display the words introduce your project. Then for my subheading, I'm going to have this display the words tell people why they should be excited about your project. Perfect. And when it comes to the input fields I want to add into this specific group, I actually only need one. So I can delete all of these existing input fields here. We don't need them. So I'm just going to select on all of my headings as well as all of the input fields. And we're just going to delete these. I'll scroll on up, select the additional ones and delete those. And the input field we're going to use doesn't actually exist inside of our bubble editor yet. What I want to do is add in a rich text editor, which a rich text editor, if you're not familiar with, allows someone to actually not only add in text, but they can modify the formatting of that text. So they can bold text, add hyperlinks, add images, they can align it, they can underline it. They can do so many different things inside of a rich text editor. And look, thankfully, Bubble has a free plugin which allows us to add our own rich text editor into our app. So what we're going to do is jump over to the plugins library here, and we're going to add a new plugin. And we're just going to type in the word rich text, and we're going to install the very first plugin you see here, which is the rich text editor built by Bubble. And this, of course, is a free plugin. Once we've installed that, we can then close our plugin library. We don't need to configure anything here, but if we jump over to our design tab, what you'll now see under our input forms is that we have a rich text editor that we can add in here. Now for this rich text editor, it is just like a standard input field in the fact that I need to give this a name. So I'm going to call this rich text editor campaign description. I'm also then going to scroll on down, and you can choose to update the complexity of what kind of settings people have when it comes to changing or formatting the text. So right now it's set as full. I'm just going to set this to medium. This is just a preference of mine. As you can see, it's just going to remove some of the settings that they have. If you want to make yours the full option, that's completely fine. You can even make it the basic option if you really wanted. But I think the medium is a happy middle ground. While I'm here though, I am just going to scroll on down and give this a solid border. So that way when I click away, I can actually see where this sits inside of my group. And of course, like any other input element, I need to jump over to my layout tab and configure the responsive settings of this. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. We'll make this fully responsive by setting the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. And for the minimum height, I'm quite happy to leave this as is. So it's currently 200 pixels, but you'll notice that this has an infinite max height. And so similar to a multi-line input field, this just means that this input field can expand down if a user adds lots of text into this, which they most likely will. This is where they're going to share their life story about the project and how much it means to them. So you're going to need a lot of space for this. And thankfully, when the height is infinite, this will continually just expand down and wrap around all of the text that they add in. Finally, I'm just going to add 30 pixels of margin at the top, none on the bottom, but 20 on the left and 20 on the right. And that's actually everything we need to add into this group. However, there is one change that we also need to make, and that is to our button here. So right now we have 2 next buttons, and in a moment, we're going to create some workflows that obviously hide and display each of these groups every single time one of these next buttons is clicked. Now, because we're going to be creating some workflows based on a trigger when this button is clicked, we're not going to be able to tell these 2 buttons apart. So it's important that we also update the naming conventions for these buttons. So I'm going to call this button next group 2. And then for my first group, I'm going to call this button next group 1. And now from here, we can build out our third and final group, which if you remember is the group where a user can add in the rewards that people are going to receive if they back this campaign. And so what this is going to look like if I jump over into my separate browser is when we click next from our rich text editor, they'll obviously be able to add in their funding goal, but when they choose to add a reward tier, there's this hidden group inside of our overall group, which is going to be displayed, and they can add in the details for each individual reward. Now, when they add in a reward, it's going to display it in a repeating group below this, which is this red line you see here. That's essentially just a repeating group that has no data to display right now. And look, in our next module, I'm going to walk through how we can create that repeating group. But right now, I just want to focus on designing this group as well as this little hidden group that's hidden and displayed within that group. Because look, I already think that that is more than enough to handle inside of this module. So let's jump back into our bubble editor. I'm going to close my property editor, and I'm actually going to make a copy of my first group again. So I'm going to select this, make a copy, and if I head right to the bottom of my page, I can see there is another copy of that. The first thing I'll do is update the name of this. It's going to be called group step 3. That's perfect. And similar to before, all we need to do is update our headings as well as the input fields that we want to show. So for the first heading, I'm going to have this display the words, let's talk about money. Which, by the way, this is the actual text that's displayed in the real world Kickstarter app. So we're going to try and make it as close as we can to the real experience. And for our subtext here, I'm just going to have this display the words, share your funding goals. Now for this group, we actually only need one input field for now. So once again, I'm going to select on all of my input fields here. I'm going to delete these. I'll grab the rest of these and also delete those. And all I want to do is just keep in the very first input field. And for the text above this input field, I'm going to have this display the words funding goal amount. And of course, for the input field below this, I'll need to update the name of this. I'm going to call this funding goal amount. But for this input field, I don't want this to store text inside of it. Instead, I would like it to store a currency. So I want someone to be able to type in a numeric value and have a currency prefix that will be displayed in front of that. And my currency is going to be dollars, but you can select euros, pounds, whatever's going to suit your currency. But this will allow us to store whatever value is typed in here as a number. I'm also then just going to jump over to my layout tab and set the maximum width to be not 800, but instead 400, because I don't really need that much space unless you're really trying to raise $1 trillion squidzillion dollars, which I don't think you are. And if you are, good luck trying to raise that on Kickstarter. Now from here below this input field, what I need to do is add in a group element, which is going to display two elements inside it side by side. And so what do I mean by that? If I was to once again jump over to my separate browser that I had before, as you'll see, this red group here contains a text element as well as a button that sits directly beside it. So this container layout is obviously a row, and these are horizontally positioned beside each other. So we need to go and add another group inside of our main group. So if we scroll on up to our containers menu, we'll grab a group, add this in below my input field. And the first thing I'll do with this group is just detach the default style of this, give this a flat background color, and I'll make this a light shade of red, just so for the time being, I can see where this actually sits in my page. Now for this group, I'm also going to jump to my layout tab and set the container layout to be a row, because as I mentioned, I want to position two elements side by side. Now look, we will need to come back later on and update all of the height, the width, and the margin settings, but for the time being, we just need to add our two elements inside of it. So the first thing I'll do is just make a copy of this text element. I'll paste it into my red group, and this is just going to display the words add reward tiers. And when it comes to this text, I'm going to jump to my layout tab, and first of all, I'm just going to update the margins here. I'm going to set the top margin to be 10 pixels, the bottom margin to be 10 pixels. I will remove the left margin because I want this to be positioned right against the border of my red group. And look, I can see that I've set the bottom margin as 100, not 10. But I'll also just keep the right margin at 20 because I want some space between the button that I'm about to add in. And look, while I'm here, I will also vertically align this text in the center of my red group. Then from here, we can add a button element into our group. So if we scroll on up to our visual elements, I'll grab a button, I'll add this in, and I'll just have this display the words add reward. And for this button, I'd like to update the style of this to be our outline button style, which is our white button. And if we jump over to our layout tab here, once again, we're going to vertically align this button in the center of my red group, so it sits perfectly in line with my text. I'm quite happy to leave the width and the height settings as they are, but I will just add 10 pixels of margin at the top, 10 on the bottom, and I don't need to add any margins on the left or the right. From here, I can then select on my red group, and because I've finished adding all of my elements inside of this, I can now make this fully responsive. So I will set the minimum width as 0, of course leaving the maximum width as infinite. And then I'm going to also set the minimum height to be 0, so that way it collapses around all of the elements inside of it. And then from here, I'm also just going to add 20 pixels of margin at the top, none on the bottom, but 20 on the left and 20 on the right there. Now, while we're here, I might also just try and quickly make sure that this group is going to be fully responsive on my page. So if I jump over to my responsive view here, I can see that as my page expands, this looks great. As it shrinks though, when it comes to 320 pixels, what I can see is that this text is actually being squished quite a bit by this button here. So this button is a fixed width, which means that it is very stubborn. It does not ever want to not be 150 pixels, which then means that this text here is begging at the mercy of this button because it doesn't have any space to fit inside of this red square. So what we also need to do is perhaps set a minimum width on this text to also make it stubborn. So that way, instead of trying to squish onto one line, they decide to just both not budge and move on top of each other. So what we could do perhaps is just select on this text element here. And so in order to find the perfect minimum width for this text element, we just need to factor in how much width we have on the page, as well as how many margins we need to work around. And so if our overall page is currently 320 pixels at the smallest possible size, what we need to factor in is that on this text element itself, it has 20 pixels of margin on the right. So keep that in mind. Then beside this red group that our text element sits within, there's another 20 pixels of margin, however, on each side. So 20 plus 20 plus 20 is 60. But then inside of the group that the red group sits within, there's another 20 pixels. So 60 pixels plus 20 is 80, plus another 20 is going to be 100. So if we had 320 pixels, we need to subtract 100 pixels from that, which gives us 220 pixels to play with. So I'm going to select on this text element, and I'm going to set the minimum width to be 220 pixels. And as you'll now see, that is going to be the perfect width to fit this inside of my red group. So as the page expands and these elements can sit beside each other, it's going to look great. But when the two elements will no longer budge and there's not room to fit both of them on one line, it's just going to break it down onto a new line there. So that's how we can create that truly responsive experience. Now below this red group, we're going to add in another group, which is going to be a hidden group that's only displayed when someone clicks on this button to add a new reward. And look, instead of building that group from scratch, we're going to make a copy of our existing first group here. So I'm going to select on this. Now, instead of just hitting paste right away, I'm going to select inside of my group step 3, and I'm going to click paste. Now, if all goes to plan, which I can see it has, this group has been pasted inside of our existing group here. I can just see it sitting at the bottom though, so I need to move this next button to the next position there. And if I just close this, as you can see, this group now sits perfectly inside of our existing group. It looks great. When it comes to this group though, we just need to make a few modifications to all of the inputs as well as the titles. First of all, I just want to remove these two large titles. We no longer need those. Then when it comes to our input fields and the titles above them, I'm just going to make a few minor tweaks. For this first text element, I'm just going to call this the reward title. So this is where someone can add in the name of the specific reward that someone can back. And then if I select on the input field below this, we just need to update the name of this as well. So I'm going to call this the reward title. Now, thankfully, we don't need to change anything else because we copied this across. All of the layout settings, in my opinion, are already quite fine. So I'm happy to keep those as they are. So this is just going to help speed up the process of building this entire group. Then below that input field, I'm just going to select on my next text element. And I'm going to have this display the word amount. So I want to indicate how much it's going to cost to back this project to receive this specific reward. And so if I select on the input field below this, I'm also going to update the name of this to be called reward. And for this input field, because I want this to store a dollar value similar to our funding goal, I'm actually going to set this as a currency, and I'll set my currency prefix as dollars. And I'm also just going to reduce the size of this because I don't need all of this space. I'm going to halve it right down the middle. So under my layout tab, I'm just going to set the maximum width here to be 400 pixels, and that is literally all I need to change. Then below this, I'm going to grab my category heading, and I'm going to update this to display the word description. And what I'd like to do is add in a multi-line input field below this, which is going to allow someone to type in the specific overview of what they will receive in this reward. So if I scroll on down to my input forms, I'm going to grab a multi-line input, insert this just above my drop-down menu, And this is going to be called multi-line input reward description. And from here, I'll just need to quickly update the responsive settings. So if I jump to my layout tab, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width to 0. And I'd like this to sit in line with my existing large input field, so my reward title, which means I'm going to set the maximum width as 800 pixels there. I'll also set the minimum height to be 48 pixels because that is the same height as my single line input field. But of course, with a multi-line input field, there's no maximum height. So if the description is quite long, it will just continually expand out and fit in as much text as they need. I'll then just need to add 20 pixels of margin on both the left and the right hand side. And that's all I need to add for this. I'll select on my drop-down menu, which we no longer need. I'll delete that. And the very last thing I'll need to do is update the name of the thumbnail image text. I'm just going to have this display the word image. And for the picture uploader element below this, I'm going to reuse this as well. However, I will just need to update the name of this. So instead of calling it the thumbnail image, it's just going to be the reward image. And that is all of the input fields I need to store when you're creating a reward. So I'm going to click on everything else here and delete that. And when it comes to my button, I'm just going to select on this and I'm going to have this display the words save reward. And while I'm here, I'm also going to need to update the naming convention of this. So because I copied this group from group 1, it's also copied that name across. So what I'm going to do is call this button next save reward. And I'm going to need to do the exact same thing for the button in my overall third group here. So if I select on this button, which is the next button, instead of this displaying the word next, because this is the last group, I'm going to actually have this display the word save. However, for the name of this, I am going to call this button next group 3. And perhaps I could say it's called button save group 3. But I just need to know or tell myself that this is the button in group 3 there. Finally, I'm then going to select on my group that sits inside of my main group. So this is the group that contains all of my rewards. And I can just see at the bottom here, I've got a little bit too much margin. And that's because if I head to my layout tab, this group also has a bottom margin. And one thing you might have noticed is that when I'm working with Bubble, I like to keep all of my margins on the top. So I know specifically where those gaps in my app belong to which specific elements. But another thing we need to build out for this specific group inside of our main group is that I don't want this to be visible by default. I only want it to be shown when someone clicks this button to add a reward, and I want this to slide down. And then eventually when they create a reward later on in our application, they're going to hit save and it's going to actually collapse this group. So it will just hide it once again. So what I need to do is double click on this group, head to my layout tab, and I'm going to unselect this option to make this element visible on page load, which means it is now hidden by default. And when this group is not being displayed, I'd like to tick this option to collapse this element when it's hidden. So that way it doesn't take up any empty space on my page. And then finally, I'm also going to select this additional option to animate the collapse operation, which just means that when it is shown or when it's hidden or collapsed, it's just going to look nice. And I want this to slide up and down. You can choose whatever you want, but I'm happy with that option there. And look, while we're building out this feature to hide and display this group, what I'm going to do is build out the workflow that actually does that. So if I was to select on my add reward button here, I'm going to jump to my appearance tab and I'm going to choose to add a workflow whenever someone clicks on this. And inside of this workflow, it's pretty straightforward. I'm going to head to my element actions and I'm just going to choose to toggle an element. So toggle means that it's just going to show this group if it's hidden or hide it if it's displayed. So it's going to toggle it on and off. And the element, of course, is going to be our group, which I have not updated the naming convention for. So if we jump back to our design tab, I'm going to select on this group and I'm going to call this group rewards. And then I can jump back to my workflow tab and I can now see that that group is selectable or easily visible, I should say. Now, because this workflow is going to be related to a feature in my build where you can add rewards to a project, what I'm going to do is select on the overall workflow trigger and color code this as blue. So that way, whenever I see a blue workflow, I know that this is in fact related to my rewards feature. I can then jump back to my design tab here. And now the very last thing we need to do in this section of our module today is just create a way to hide and display all of my groups. So only one of these groups should be displayed at any given point in time. And so how can we create that experience? Look, there is multiple ways you can do this inside a bubble, and there are no right or wrong ways, I should say. But my preferred way of building this out is by using what's known as custom states. Now, if you're relatively new to Bubble, I don't expect you to know what custom states are at all, and that's completely fine. Long story short, a custom state is just a way of temporarily storing data inside of your page. Now, why would you want to do that? Because look, instead of storing data in your database, which is going to permanently sit there until you need to reference it, sometimes you don't want information to have to be stored in your database because you don't want to clog it up with unnecessary information that you don't need. And so with custom states, they allow you to just store data on your page. And what I mean by temporarily is that if someone was to refresh their page, it would just remove that data from it. So it's no longer storing that information in the page. And so the data I want to store in my page today is I just want to recognize, hey, should group number 1 be displayed? And I'm going to store that as yes or no. Is group number 2, should it be displayed? Yes or no? And of course, should group number 3 be displayed? And I'll store that as yes and no. And the easiest way to create a custom state is just by double clicking on your overall page. Now look, you can add custom states into groups or other elements, but I like to store mine on my page just to keep everything consistent so that way I know where they all belong. Now this is a cool little hack inside of Bubble, but if you were to select on the property editor here for your overall page, so this is my create page. If you select this little information icon, it's going to open up this little hidden menu known as the element inspector. And as you can see, this is where we can create a new custom state. And when I create a custom state, it looks very familiar to the process of creating a data field in your database. And that's because you're essentially just creating a data field on your page. And so that's what I mean about being able to temporarily store data in your page. And so when it comes to the name of this state, I'm going to call this display step 1. And as I said, this state type is going to be a yes/no option. So I'll create that. And of course, when this page is loaded, I would like group number 1 or group step 1 to be displayed by default. So I'm going to set the default value here to equal yes. I'll then add another state, and I'm going to call this display step 2. And this will once again be a yes/no data type because we either do want to display this step or we don't. And for this default value, I'm actually going to set this to be no because I don't want this shown as soon as the page is loaded. And look, we'll do the exact same thing for step 3. So I'll create another state and I'm going to call this display step 3. This state type will be a yes/no value, and I'm going to set the default value to equal no. And that is all we need to do in terms of creating custom states. But we do now need to create some sort of way to store or change the values of these states. So when someone comes down and clicks this next button, I want step 1 state to be now no, and step 2 state to be yes. And then when someone clicks the next button, we should set the display step 2 state as no and the display step 3 state as yes. So how can we do that? We can build out workflows that do that for us. So if we head on down to our first next button, so this is the button next in group number 1, I'm going to choose to add a workflow here. And within this workflow, if I just type in the word state, I can set the state of an element. And that element will be my overall create page. And all I'm going to do is update the display step 1 state from being yes to now be no. And then I'm going to make display step 2 state equal yes. And now something I personally just like to do is make sure that my display step 3 state is also still no. And that's all you need to do in order to update the values or the data stored in your custom state on the page. One thing I would just like to do is just after this button is clicked, I want to scroll back up to the top of my page. So that way when my new group is shown, a user is moved back to the top of that group. And I'll show you what that looks like when I run a preview of my app. But essentially what we just need to do is add an additional step into my workflow and just type in the word scroll. And I'm going to scroll to an element. And that element is going to be my overall create page. So it's going to scroll back to the top of the page. Now look, when it comes to my workflows that are related to custom states, I'm not going to worry about color coding these. These can just be color coded in gray. But after building out this first workflow, we need to jump over to our design tab and we need to create a very similar workflow when our second next button is clicked. So I'm going to select on this, which is button next group number 2. I'm going to choose to add a workflow here. And instead of building this from scratch, what I can do is actually make a copy of my existing workflow. So what I could do is copy each workflow step by right-clicking on it, or I could just grab the entire workflow and make a copy here. I could delete this existing workflow that I just created, and I can right click here and paste this in. The only thing I'll need to do is update the trigger for this workflow. So instead of triggering this on button next group 1, it will be button next group 2. And all I now need to do is update which states are going to be set. So display step 1 should still be set as no. However, this time display step 2 should also be set as no, and display step 3 should be set as yes. And that is all we need to change for this workflow. Once again, after these states are set and our groups are going to be hidden and displayed, I'd like to scroll back to the top of my page, which is fine. And one thing I should just point out is that we don't actually need to build out the workflow for our third next button or our save button in our third group, just because this workflow is going to be different. We're actually not going to set a state in that workflow. We're going to do something entirely different. We're going to create a new project inside of our Kickstarter database. And we're going to do that within the next module of this course. I wanted to break this down into a separate section. But the last thing we need to do when it comes to our groups is just create some conditions which are going to hide and display these. So at the moment, we've created our custom state. That's great. We've built out the workflows to store the data of each custom state when we want it. However, all of these groups are still visible by default, whereas what we need to do is hide them by default and only allow them to be displayed based on the data stored in our custom states. So if I select on group step 1 here, what I'm going to do is jump to my layout tab, and I'm going to unselect that this group should be visible on page load. I'm also going to select this option to collapse this group when it's hidden, because as you can see, although it's not being displayed, it's taking up all this empty space on my page, which is not what I want to happen. So I'm going to tick this option to collapse this group when it's hidden. Now, if you ever want to display this group, you can head over to your elements tree, and I can see it's here. And all you got to do is just click this little eye icon. But what I now need to do is create a way or a condition to recognize when this group should be shown. So I'm going to head to my conditional tab for group step 1. I'm going to define a condition, and I'm going to recognize when my overall create page, when the display step 1 state is in fact yes, I will select that this element is visible, and I will leave that ticked as true. And of course, by default, display step 1 state was yes when the page was loaded, so this group will now be shown. I'm then going to scroll on down to my group step 2, and we're going to replicate the exact same process. So what I'm going to do is jump to my layout tab here. I will uncheck that this element should be visible on page load. I will collapse this element when it's hidden. We'll then create a condition and recognize when the overall create page, when its display step 2 custom state is yes, this element is visible, and tick that that is true. And then we'll do the exact same thing for our third group here. So I'm going to jump to my layout tab, uncheck that this should be visible by default. I will collapse this element when it's hidden. Then I'll jump to my conditional tab, define a condition, and recognize when my overall create page, when its display step 3 state is yes, you've guessed it, this element should be visible, and we will leave that ticked as true. Now look, that is absolutely everything I want to cover when it comes to designing this page in this module. There was already quite a lot that I've just walked you through. In my opinion, this part of the build was not too difficult. It's more just time consuming, setting everything up exactly how you want it. And look, thankfully, the whole process of setting up those custom states, in my opinion, was relatively straightforward. There are a lot more powerful things you can do with custom states, but I don't want to overcomplicate things today. The last thing we need to do though is just create a way for users to actually come to this page. So what we need to do is jump over to our navigation menu. And if you remember, inside of this navigation menu, there was this button here which was known as Start a Project. So when this button is clicked, what I want to do is create a navigation workflow and send someone through to the page that we literally just created. So I'm going to choose to add a workflow when this button is clicked. And inside of this workflow, I'm going to head to a navigation event, select the go to page action, and the destination page will be our create page. And because this is a navigation workflow, I'm going to select on the workflow trigger and set the event color here to be red. And that is literally everything we need to build out within this section of our course today. And so what we can now do is run a preview of our product here. And when I select to start a new project, it's going to redirect me through to the create page. And as you'll see, by default, our first group is being displayed. And that's because the custom state, if you remember, had the default value of displaying group step 1. Now, if I scroll on down, there are no additional groups on this page. If I was to hit next, it will hide my first group. And as you just saw, it scrolled back to the top of my page. So now I can clearly see group step 2. If I then hit next again, it's going to hide group step 2, display group step 3. And if I wanted to add a reward, when I click this, it's going to toggle this group on and off there, as you can see. Now, of course, if you hit save, nothing is going to happen. So there's no point really adding any information into your input fields right now. But as you can see, this is the crux of our overall experience. So I'm quite happy that we're making a lot of progress in this particular part of our build. So let's just jump back over to our Notion checklist. And what I'm going to do is tick off that we've finished building out the first part of this experience, where we can allow our users to create a project inside of our database. And as I said, within the next module, this is where we're going to start to connect everything together with functional workflows. And just like that, that is all I have time to include within this video today. As you can see, we've been building for literally hours, and there's still so many features that I need to uncover in as much detail as possible. If you wanted to watch the rest of my Kickstarter clone course, I'd recommend hitting the link in the description of this video, so that way you can get access to the entire course. Now, while that full course is going to cost you money, I'm confident that it's going to save you months of time having to learn how to rebuild all of the individual features from scratch. So if you really want to launch your app as quickly as possible, I definitely recommend checking it out. At this point in time, there's still so many features that we need to uncover. We still need to create our own custom search feature, a dynamic project page to display the full details of each individual project. We then need to create a way to process payments, so that way our users can back and fund projects. We need to build out a user's profile page, a dashboard to display analytics about each project, and of course, a way for creators of a project to publish updates to the community. I truly wasn't lying when I said there's still so many features that we need to walk through. If you wanted to stay up to date with any additional Bubble resources that I share, I'd always recommend hitting that subscribe button on my channel, so that way you can be the first to know whenever I drop a new video. For now though, I just wanted to say a massive thank you for watching up to this point of our tutorial today, and I wish you all of the best on your own no-code journey.